I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Would you please do the roll call?
Present.
Commissioner Silberman,
Present.
Commissioner Corral,
Present.
Commissioner Harper-Pedersen, present. Chair Marsters.
Present. Okay. Public comment. Public comment is limited to items not on the agenda. The Commission may briefly respond to statements made or questions posed as allowed by the Brown Act. However, the Commission's general policy is to refer items to staff for attention or have a matter placed on a future Commission agenda for a more comprehensive action or report. Is there anybody that would like to speak under public comment? Please come to the microphone.
Hi. I'd like to, not at this meeting, but at some time in the future, discuss East San Carlos and the businesses behind there and whether or not we could have as a condition a conditional use permit before a new business moves in, because we have some structural issues with that street and with the buildings there. Something to table for a future meeting.
Okay. Staff, I see, has made note of that. Thank you. Approval of the minutes.
I reviewed them. I don't have any comments.
Yeah, I have no changes.
Do I have a motion?
I move approval.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. We're going to move on to the public hearing. Let's see how we're going to do this. I'm not sure that we're going to follow this completely, but we're going to start out with reading what it says about public hearings. The procedure for a public hearing: staff will present a report on the history, physical features. In this case, that's already been done. The applicant will make a presentation. That's already been done. I'm not going to finish reading this. We're just going to continue on with the public hearing that is already in place, and we're going to start with actually a couple of things that I would like to say here as far as the procedure goes. The first thing I'd like to do is to ask my fellow commissioners for a little bit of help with a couple of things. The first is, as the speakers are speaking tonight, if you feel that they're off topic, please help me by letting me know that they've gone too far astray from the given topics that we have listed here. The second thing is that somewhere around 10:15, I would like to have a motion to continue the public hearing, if you so choose, and that will give us an additional 15 minutes to finish other commission business before we hit our 10:30 deadline for the meeting. That being said, I also want to talk a little bit to the audience here and say that we have a tremendous amount of material to get through here. I need everyone to sign a card if you plan on speaking. One card will allow you to speak on multiple different topics, should you choose. Realistically, you're going to have about 2 minutes to speak. You're going to have additional time if you're giving us new information. If you're going over the same thing or you diverge from the topic that we happen to be talking about this at the time, we're going to ask you to wait until the end, where there is sort of a catch-all, sort of other topics. I would encourage you not to banter back and forth between the audience. please speak to the commission, not the audience. And there will be an opportunity after all the other topics have been discussed for items that do not fit under any other topic. So that being said, I'm going to continue on and ask for the staff report on Actually, we're going to start with Al.
Mr. Survey, before you start, I just wanted to add, since the last meeting, I met with Ms. Chang.
Okay.
She called me and asked to meet with me, and I met with her.
And I have had, again, more conversations with individuals from Legacy. I have had conversations with neighbors. I've had conversations with business people. We're going to continue to have those conversations. Thank you.
Good evening, Honorable Chair, members of the Planning Commission. I'm Al Sabay, Community Development Director with the City of San Carlos, and I'd like to make some introductions this evening. To start out with, we have Camus Steinmetz, who's our Deputy City Attorney, to provide a report on thresholds of significance and nexus for you. We also have Greg Rubens here this evening, our City Attorney. As we are continuing the discussion of transportation issues, we have Gary Black with Hexagon, who prepared the traffic report. We also have Brian Canepa with Nelson Nygaard to provide you with a report, presentation on parking and how parking works at TODs and how the parking provided it here at this proposed project works. Also, there's a number of other folks here who can answer questions. For instance, Sherry Scott is the project architect for the developer Legacy Partners. She's here to talk about shadows, and she can also answer your questions if we get to the visual component of your discussion this evening. She can answer questions, walk you through the site plan, that kind of thing. The developers here, Jeff Bird and Jesse Couch from Legacy Partners, they're here to answer questions as well. We have Brian Fitzpatrick from Samtrans, and of course Deborah Nelson, our planning manager, and Stephanie Bertolo Davis, our senior planner. So with those introductions, we're all here to assist you and answer your questions this evening, and that's all I have unless you have any additional questions.
Thank you, Al.
Okay.
What I do want to make the other commissioners aware of, there were two additional pieces of documents that we received, one from Thomas Knudsen and the other from Amy Chang.
Is the letter from Amy Chang the same one that was emailed to us?
Yes.
It's the corrected letter that was emailed.
Not the corrected letter.
Yes.
It was the. Oh, it is the corrected one. Okay, it is the corrected letter. I stand corrected.
Okay. Well, then I won't read it again.
Okay. Please.
Another one and then that one too.
Okay, thank you. Camus Steinmetz, Deputy City Attorney, and good evening, Honorable Chair and members of the Commission. So I'm going to present a brief overview of CEQA requirements for identifying and mitigating significant environmental impacts or effects. Those terms are used interchangeably. CEQA defines a significant environmental effect or impact as a substantial or potentially substantial adverse change in the environment. An environment is defined as the physical conditions as they exist in the area that will be affected by the project. So there's really two steps in determining whether an impact is significant or not. First, the impact on the environment is measured or calculated. And to measure the impact of a project, the EIR examines the changes to existing environmental conditions, often referred to as the baseline, that occur in the affected area if the project were implemented. So generally this means that the EIR compares what will happen if the project is built with what will happen if the project is not built or the site is left alone. The EIR examines a project's impact on the environment in general, not whether the project will affect the environment of particular individuals. So for example, courts have held that obstruction of a few private views is not generally considered a significant environmental impact because this is an effect on particular persons, not the environment as a whole.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
Because when I met with Ms. Chang, one of the things that she expressed concern about was the issue of noise south of the current depot. Basically, she said that she didn't understand why there wasn't a noise evaluation south of the depot, only on the east side. And her concern was as the operations sort of move south, there would be noise that would be generated from that. And my initial reaction was, well, isn't the noise just shifting? And is what you're saying is if the noise level is the same, but it just shifts from one location to another, that would not be considered a significant impact?
If it's not caused by the project itself, you mean, and it's just shifted as a result of the project?
Well, yeah, the project, because rather than folks parking where they currently park and folks, entering the parking lot where they currently park, instead it's going to be, to the south because all of the parking is going to shift to the south. And I would agree with her. She's concerned that that's going to increase noise to the south. But my initial reaction was, yes, it will increase noise to the south, but it will reduce noise to the north. And so my question is, when we talk about significance, is if the noise just shifts and it doesn't increase, is that considered significant?
Well, and that's the second step. So we'll get to that second step. So the first step is really to measure and calculate the change in the environment. And that's usually done within a certain vicinity that the EIR will identify for each impact, and it can be different for traffic as it is for noise, it is for aesthetics. And the EIR will identify the reasons why it's choosing a certain radius from the project, and that's in which to measure. And there's obviously there has to be an end limit as to what is measured. And so CEQA does not require that the analysis be perfect or exhaustive. The depth and breadth of the analysis is limited to what is reasonably feasible. So that's generally a call that the EIR consultant will make as to where to end that analysis. So after measuring the project's impact on the environment, the second step is to then determine whether this impact is significant or not, significant or less than significant. And to make this determination, the EIR typically identifies and applies what are called standards or thresholds of significance for each potential environmental impact. And the threshold of significance for a given environmental impact is simply the level at which the lead agency finds the effects of the project to be significant. So if an impact is found to exceed the threshold, it is determined to be significant, and if it's below the threshold, it is less than significant. And these thresholds of significance are different for each impact, and they can be based on a number of sources, including policies adopted and implemented by the lead agency, like general plan, zoning, thresholds of significance that are formally adopted by lead agencies, performance standards adopted or recommended by regulatory agencies, and then the standards in the initial study checklist in the CEQA guidelines, which many of the thresholds are derived from. And the EIR's conclusion that an environmental impact is significant is not necessarily binding on the lead agency's decision-making body. The decision makers may find that a project will or will not result in a significant impact despite a contrary conclusion in the EIR, if the finding is supported by substantial evidence in the record. Substantial evidence includes facts, reasonable assumptions predicated upon facts, and expert opinions supported by facts. So argument, speculation, unsubstantiated opinion or narrative, and evidence which is clearly inaccurate or erroneous or not supported by facts, that's not substantial evidence. And the time for making these CEQA findings, including those that may differ from the conclusions in the EIR, is at the time the project is approved and not at the time of EIR certification. So that's, in our process, that would be in the phase 2 part. And once an EIR has identified a significant environmental impact, it must propose feasible mitigation measures to avoid or reduce the level of this impact. And mitigation measures are only required for significant environmental impacts. CEQA does not require mitigation for less than significant impacts. There are limits on what mitigation measures can be imposed. CEQA does not require analysis of every imaginable mitigation measure. It only requires analysis of feasible mitigation measures that will effectively reduce or avoid the identified significant environmental impact. And feasible under CEQA means capable of being accomplished in a successful manner within a reasonable period of time, taking into account economic, environmental, social, and technological factors. And like with any exaction or condition of approval, there are constitutional limitations on what mitigation measures can be imposed. There must be an essential nexus or connection between the project's impacts and the mitigation measure imposed, and the extent or degree of the mitigation measure imposed must be roughly proportional to the impacts caused by the project. So there both has to be a connection, and then that there has to be a roughly proportional the mitigation measure must be roughly proportional to the impacts caused by the project. So an agency can't force an applicant to provide a generalized public benefit unrelated to the impacts caused by the applicant's project, or require the applicant to more than fully mitigate the impacts of the project. If the agency decides to approve the project, it must make specific findings as to whether the mitigation measures identified for each significant impact will avoid or substantially reduce the significant impact. And again, the time for making those findings on the mitigation measures is at the time of project approval after the EIR has been certified. So thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I have one quick one. So
Okay.
it sounded like that you would be able to find that there were environmental impacts even in the second phase of the project, even though we could pass the environmental, the EIR, and then as the developer comes forward with the final plan, you can still find environmental impacts at that stage.
Yes, at that point you would make your CEQA findings, where you make individual findings on each identified significant environmental impact, and make findings on whether mitigation measures avoid or reduce those impacts, and you can
Okay.
make different conclusions than what is in the EIR if that's supported by substantial evidence in the record, and so that would be at the second phase.
Okay.
And that occasionally can happen.
I'm sorry. To go back to my question, I just want to make sure that, because I want to make sure we're doing what we're supposed to. Ms. Chang indicated to me that she was concerned that noise south of the depot wasn't studied. And so I'm trying to understand whether that was something that actually needed to be studied. And so I guess my impression from what you said earlier was that if the impact is just shifted, then it's not considered significant and therefore doesn't need to be studied if it isn't increased. Is that?
Well, if it's not above the threshold, I mean, if there was no noise and then the noise in that area has then increased, is that what you're saying? I mean, so it has increased in an area.
I'm not being abstract. I mean, I look at obviously there's noise that's caused by the location of a parking lot. I mean, that's just common sense. There's going to be
Right.
noise. If the parking lot or the primary parking is shifting from the north of the depot to a location where right now there's just dirt, well, actually pumpkins right now, but normally just dirt, I mean, that's going to increase noise. And so I guess my question is, when does that need to be studied? If it's just shifting the noise from one location to another, does that need to be studied?
May I,
Yes, that'd be very helpful.
Mr. Chairman? I mean, the question is that significant? Is it reasonable to assume that the slamming of car doors or cars pulling in and out of a driveway is a significant noise impact? Right now, there's cars that park on El Camino, and there's cars that go up and down El Camino, and there's an ambient baseline noise that's there now. So what we're talking about is the Samtrans parking shifting down to Cherry Street. Is it reasonable to assume that that's a more significant impact? And I would say no. There's already noise there. I think we heard from, and we see in our general plan noise element that there's a significant amount of noise on El Camino now. So, shifting the parking lot, would that increase noise in a significant 3 decibel points higher? It just doesn't seem reasonable to assume that it would. So that's why it wasn't studied. And I wouldn't recommend that it be studied, because it's just not, if you look at the facts of what's happening, it just doesn't seem like car doors and cars coming in and out would make a 3 dB increase. On the other side of the tracks, we saw that there could potentially be a 1 dB increase with the project and the train. So that's the reason.
That's responsive. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you. No one else? Okay. No? Okay. Then we're going to move back to a continued discussion of transportation with a focus on parking impacts. And we're going to start with transportation. And the first speaker card that I have is Mark Olbert. And I only have 7 speaker cards. Why don't you come to the microphone after Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commission members. It's a little different being down here in the well.
Welcome.
Yes, and thank you, Michael, for taking care of my chair. Actually, it's not mine. I just wanted to tell you that I have been attending these last couple of discussions. I want to make clear I am not in any way, shape, or form, even by my presence here, trying to influence any of your thinking or deliberations. I frankly find the back and forth and the discussion to be highly educational on a topic that, because I'm relatively new to city government, the more I can learn, the better. So I'm just here mostly listening and learning. But I do want to thank you all very much for your efforts. This is one of those times when it's literally a thankless job. There is, I suspect, there will be a lot of people that would be unhappy regardless of what ends up being the outcome of these deliberations. And I also wanted to just say I was very glad that Chairman Marsters had pointed out the issue of making sure that discussion stays on track with your topic, because it's very easy, as I've been learning more about EIR processes, it's very easy for people to misunderstand what the scope of an EIR discussion is, and there ends up being discussions about entitlement issues as opposed to EIR issues. That's an inside baseball kind of thing for the vast majority of citizens, and so probably one has to be careful about educating them on what's the topic for tonight. But I'm glad that you brought it up, and it might not even be a bad idea to explain to people a little bit more about what the differences are. So, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Jenk, could you please fill out a card? Oh, you did. Okay. Thank you.
I just had a quick question, because it appears that CEQA is very fact-based and data-driven, and I would ask that, is there any data with respect to noise levels on the west side of El Camino in order to draw the conclusion that there's no significant impact? And I think this is certainly relevant in light of changes in zoning to that district, which is now zoned as multi-use, as you all know, which means that the zoning will allow for residential on the west side of El Camino.
I can try and answer that question. Yes, there is data for El Camino Real. It's in the general plan, and there's a map in here as well, and it shows traffic and railroad noise level contours, and it talks about and it's figure 9.3 on page right before page 239. And what it shows is that the decibel levels on El Camino Real are quite high. They're in the 70 to 75 dBA range. And so That's the traffic, that's the train noise. So that's the high end of the train noise. So again, going back to the commissioner's question about moving the parking, is cars going in and out of a parking lot or car doors slamming? Would that be more significant than 75 dBA? And it's very, very unlikely that would occur. And I think our general plan does acknowledge that that El Camino Real, being our one of our primary thoroughfares, is a very noisy place, and there's train noise and car noise. But it also recognizes that this is the area of our city where there's a richness of transportation, resources, and the intent of the general plan in some regards is to place our higher density housing near transit. And that is the area that has been designated in the general plan for more high-density housing.
68.
68.
Page, 9.9. Table 9.2 shows El Camino, San Carlos Avenue to Britton Avenue, LDN at 75 feet, DBAs at 68 as the existing level. Okay. Okay, so the topic at the moment will be transportation. We're going to continue on with traffic and other forms of transportation before we move on to parking. So if anybody would like to come up, I have a bunch of speakers. I believe, Mark, you wanted to speak on housing and not on traffic? Okay, so we're going to set that aside until we get to land use. Paul Maginetti.
Paul Maginetti, City of San Carlos. I have a point to bring up that relates to traffic. In my letter 25 on the draft EIR, I asked the question, why is the San Carlos Avenue Improvements Project not part of this EIR? It is, the only reason it's being done is it is needed to be able to do this transit village. So by not including it, you're improperly segmenting it, you're piecemealing this out. This really needs to be included, and it needs to have an addendum to the CEQA to account for this, because these two little projects, or big projects, are inextricably linked. One is necessary for the other, and it needs to be considered. Thank you.
Thank you. Dimitri Vandalos.
We're specifically talking about traffic, or?
Yes, we're specifically talking about traffic and transportation.
Okay.
We will talk about parking next,
Okay, thank you.
and then we will move on to land use.
Regarding traffic and transportation, the EIR does not mention the new multimodal transit center. That multimodal transit center is receiving federal funding, and any project that receives federal funding is subject to NEPA requirements, NEPA, and I'm curious as to why there's an omission with the multimodal station in regards to NEPA, particularly given that the property has had 3 gas stations and several auto dealerships. Gas stations, those tanks leak, and a friend of mine from the EPA has said that essentially every old gas station it turns into a toxic dump. So I'd want to make sure that we do the proper cleanup regarding that. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to diverge here. I'm just asking about that multimodal station and making sure that we follow NEPA for it.
before I move on, Al, do you want to attempt to address some of these items as they come along, or do you want to wait until we're sort of done subject and then sort of make comments to address these items, or?
I think we can go ahead and try. I'd prefer to kind of try and address them as they came up.
Okay.
So perhaps we could try and address those first two,
Yes, so
or
let's-
we could even have Gary Black address the multimodal component. But the first one, I think Deborah Nelson can
Okay.
answer that one about the,
I'm just going to look at staff and let you
Sure.
tell me who's going to answer these questions.
and segmentation of the San Carlos Avenue improvements.
Deborah Nelson, Planning Manager. I would refer you back to your October 1st staff report, the answers to questions, and both of these issues were addressed there. Let me do the NEPA one first. There is, as the commenter noted, federal funding from the Federal Transportation Agency, and there is a NEPA clearance required, which is a separate project but related. The EIR for this project does do an analysis of the parking lot as part of the project, but the NEPA requirements will need to be met as part of the funding that SamTrans receives to recreate the parking lot. With regard to the San Carlos Avenue improvement projects, there are some in your errata package, some further description of what that may entail. And it is a project envisioned to improve bicycle and pedestrian circulation on the 11 and 1200 blocks of San Carlos Avenue and across El Camino Real to the newly created plaza for the depot. It would also involve signalization along Holly Street at Walnut and at Laurel. There is currently a signal at Laurel. The Wheeler Plaza project also addressed that signal. It will go to a full signalization. The other one would be new. Now, the San Carlos Avenue improvement project so far has been addressed from a traffic perspective by Gary Black, and you could ask him specific questions. Should it become a project, we would need additional funding and grant money, and certainly further study for the project design, and that would have an environmental impact report regarding the specifics of the design.
Any further questions on that, or? Okay. Can you explain to us what NEPA is?
Yes, NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act. It is required when there is federal funding involved. We, as a city typically do a NEPA document when we have grant funding and need to work through Caltrans for any kind of project. Often those are categorical exclusions, so the Planning Commission does not see them.
Okay. That's what I was going to say. I don't think I've ever seen one of those documents. Okay. Any additional questions?
None on that.
No? Okay. Sam Hirschberg.
Sam Hirschberg, 996 Sylvan Drive. So are you taking comments on the different impacts, or you just focused on?
We're just focused on traffic and transportation.
Okay,
We'll get
just
to
to keep my-
parking, we'll get to all the other things. We're going to go through step by step.
Well, I would just like to comment on the prior commenters' comments about the multimodal parking area, which is, I guess, subject to a grant and therefore needs to comply with CEQA NEPA. There's no reason why an addendum to the CIR couldn't be done that addresses that issue, as it's part of the overall traffic and transportation issues associated with this transit village, especially if it involves moving any of the activities, an eighth to a quarter of a mile further south than they currently are. You need to have the whole picture in front of you, and if it's being segmented per CEQA, that's a problem. So I would make a recommendation that an addendum to the EIR be done to address that issue. And I don't see why if it was an environmental assessment, that's typically like a mitigated neg deck. If it's an EIS, that's typically like an EIR. But it could be done so you would have a complete picture on the overall project. Thank you.
Thank you. Kara Vonk?
I'm going to address the cultural issue.
Okay. Okay. Glenn?
Good evening, and thank you for hearing me. My first concern would be, as you're looking at this, that you take into consideration that the Grand Boulevard Initiative plans to take out one lane of traffic in each direction for the bus service, and that's going to increase the traffic congestion on El Camino from personal use vehicles. Secondly, since you just brought up a moment ago NEPA, NEPA requires that you consider the human environment as well. And this project is going to touch on the human environment in many ways. And therefore, it should be considered by this board as you move forward, because ultimately it is going to affect the citizens, especially on the east side. It's going to affect all of us in this community, quite honestly. In my opinion, not necessarily for the better. But since NEPA does specifically require that you consider the human environment and the impacts on the human environment, you might want to take a look at that real closely before you move forward with granting this final EIR. Thank you.
Thank you. Ben?
Ben Fuller, City of San Carlos, and I want to reiterate what I heard Mark say, which is I know this is stressful for everyone, and we all still like everyone in the room, so including Brian and Jeff and all these guys. And I think we're like what'd you call it? We're the sheepdog, in the cartoon. So we're pragmatic, and we want to find a way to make something come together and make this all work. With that said, we are concerned. We've looked at some of the emails around traffic, and Deborah, I think you can acknowledge yourself that you were very concerned that piecemealing was going to be brought up, as we read in your own email, Deborah Nelson, that you were concerned that this was going to come up, that this could be a successful challenge to the EIR you mentioned in your email, and we saw that. And Greg, you approved that lawyer who got hired and who came up with these suggestions about what you should be really concerned about, which is that we would bring up piecemealing, because this is obviously an egregious example of trying to separate two clearly related projects. The multimodal station has to move for this project to exist, and that then, because it gets federal funding, subjects it to this EIS process. And so this attempt to piecemeal can be challenged in an EIR process, and so it's just something to keep in mind. One other additional issue around traffic is I don't know what the final EIR shows, whether it's 6 or 8 additional driveways that are going onto El Camino, but that's a considerable amount of traffic that's getting dumped onto El Camino. So it's just something to consider, because we're right around that threshold of how much traffic can actually exist in San Carlos before we exceed that threshold and come into sort of emergency traffic conditions. So I'll just mention that one point. Thank you.
Okay. But before we move on, well, go ahead.
do you think it would be appropriate for staff to address?
I was going to actually ask Gary Black to step up and talk about the additional traffic, the 6 to 8 additional driveways that was talked about, the whole multimodal project. Can you sort of...
Gary Black with Hexagon Transportation Consultants. I would prefer to have a city staff person answer a question about the multimodal station project.
Okay.
We did study the project as proposed, which includes a number of driveways. I think maybe the number 6 is correct. I can look it up to see what it exactly is. Well, here's a figure. Yes, 6 driveways on El Camino. Those were considered in the traffic study, and of course the project would add traffic to El Camino since there's largely nothing there now. That was accounted for in the study. And driveways on El Camino, provided that they're designed correctly with adequate size and sight distance and so forth, does not cause any impact in terms of safety or traffic operations. There are many driveways on El Camino, and they function fine if they're designed properly. So that wouldn't constitute an impact, having driveways on El Camino. The amount of traffic on El Camino was also studied. There are thresholds that you have adopted about what constitutes an acceptable amount of traffic, and El Camino's within that standard, and with this project it would still be within that standard. So even though it would add traffic, it wouldn't push it over the threshold, so to speak.
I don't know if you can even answer this, but has there ever been, we had buildings on that side of the street a long time ago. Does whatever activity that we had then have any bearing on what we're forecasting now?
I would say essentially no. We're treating this as vacant land.
But there were multiple businesses, a car dealership,
Before-
restaurants, a
before
lumber
the
yard,
berm went up, right.
before all of that, before the tracks were moved and the berm was built. Thank you. Would somebody from staff like to address the whole issue of piecemealing and the multimodal center?
Sure, I can try and address that. I think a couple of things. One, the change to the station is analyzed in the EIR. It's a component of the EIR. It's described in the project description. So as far as the city of San Carlos is concerned, it's part of the project. So the change to the multimodal station, what it is, what it'll look like, how it will operate, has been looked at and analyzed. It's part of the project description of the CEQA document. So it's there, and it has been analyzed. Now, then there's the question that people have brought up, the fact that Samtrans received a grant to construct some of the improvements at the multimodal station. That's not, the city of San Carlos didn't receive that grant. It was Samtrans. And of course, I'm going to ask Brian to clarify that and make sure that I'm correct on that. But that's my understanding, is that Samtrans got a grant that would help them with the capital improvement project to construct the improvements if they were ever to be approved. So that's not a city project. That's not our grant. The NEPA document would then be prepared by Samtrans, and it would be approved by the Samtrans board. So perhaps Brian can clarify and see if I'm right on that one. That's it? Okay.
Would that be something that the city of San Carlos is involved in, as wouldn't have to come through San Carlos Planning Commission or City Council, but obviously we'd be commenting on it, right? Or would it have to come through?
No, it's just a grant. But what you are commenting on and considering is the CEQA document, unless, again, Brian wants to add to this, or one of the city attorneys. But again, this is the federal government saying, we think that what you're proposing here is a good idea, and we have some federal grant money to help you construct it. But the project itself and the parameters of the project is something that you, as the Planning Commission and the City Council, will consider as part of this document. So how it's being designed here, how it will operate, but not the grant in paying for it to be built.
And that will come back as part of the plan, the final plan for the project itself. We'll actually have all of the, we'll actually approve where the parking spaces and all of that is as part of the final.
That's correct. As part of the plan
As part of
development
the plan
permit,
development.
it's all in the design of the site plan.
Okay.
That's right. And I mean, in theory, Samtrans board could ask the city of San Carlos to, agree with the grant or the NEPA document or something, or we could review it as a responsible party to the development project. So that's another way that other entities ask neighboring entities to look at a document. They call it a responsible party. We wouldn't be the lead agency for the NEPA document, but a responsible party. So we could always comment on it, but it's not something that city would bring forward or city staff would bring forward to you for your approval.
Thank you.
Mr. Fitzpatrick may want to add to this.
So I'm going to ask Greg or Camus to kick me in the knee if I do anything legally wrong here, but I'm going to explain it to you from a layman's perspective the way that I understand it. We can get a clarification. So what we decided to do when we were building this project is that a transit center parking lot has independent utility. Samtrans could go out there and say, we want to build a new parking lot. It's got independent utility. We're going to go build this transit center parking lot out here. And we came back to the city and we said, city, that doesn't make sense. We're doing this as part and parcel of a development project. So rather than independently clearing this transit center, we are going to defer that to you and allow you to clear it as part of the development, so that the city has all the discretionary approval for from the CEQA point of view for the parking lot and for the transit center itself as one project. Subsequent to that, we received NEPA funding. Samtrans is going to clear that independently, but the point remains that the project needs to be cleared by CEQA. So if it's not cleared in CEQA, doesn't matter if it's cleared in NEPA, because the project then isn't cleared in CEQA. It needs to achieve both. So effectively, by making that determination that we made at the beginning of this, we deferred all decision-making power to the city when Samtrans really does have its own ability to do it independently. So the very act of the process that we created deferred that decision to the city. And if that needs to be clarified, you guys can jump in.
Well, I might pass this off to Camus, but it sounds to me what's really happening is the NEPA review is a contingency of getting the grant. And so when the federal funding, that process moves forward, that separate process to get the funding for the platform, that's when NEPA is going to be required, and that's why Samtrans is reviewing it. San Carlos is reviewing the CEQA document, and we will, at the future, when the project's ready, we'll bring back the entitlements portion of the project, and you'll make the subsequent findings then. I imagine, and I'm not certain, and this is why I'll turn over to Camus, is whether or not we would have the ability to condition the entitlements on a NEPA review being conducted by Samtrans or being completed.
When you say the moving of the platform, are you talking about shifting the loading platform south, or are you talking about a different platform?
I misspoke. It's the multimodal.
Parking lot.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, so what's triggering NEPA is only the federal funding for the transit modal portion of the project. And what Brian was saying is that essentially this is two projects by two different applicants. Legacy is doing the residential office retail component of the project, and Samtrans is developing the multimodal center. It could have been analyzed under CEQA separately, but they decided to defer, and because Samtrans is a governmental agency, it could have been its own lead agency and prepared its own CEQA document on the multimodal transit center portion of the project, but instead they chose to defer to the city, combine the two projects into one and have them studied as a whole under CEQA. The only portion of that project that requires any NEPA certification is the parking lot transit portion of the project. And the reason is because it could have federal funding.
And when it needs NEPA approval, will it go through a process similar to this?
Yes, so
Essentially-
Samtrans will then be the lead agency, as you're the lead agency under CEQA. Samtrans would be the lead agency. The NEPA document would be Samtrans' product, and they would have to certify that.
And the notification would go out to,
It would go out to all responsible agencies, which would include San Carlos, and we would have the opportunity to comment. And that would be a prerequisite for the construction of the project, would be the NEPA clearance.
and I just want to make sure that the individuals within a certain distance of that would also be notified?
I believe so. They would, yeah, I mean,
You don't, okay.
Hey, Scott, I don't know, you asked earlier, I don't know if this has to do with traffic or even the EIR. I mean, it
Okay,
seems like it's
that's fine.
completely unrelated to both, so, I mean,
let's-
it's very useful. I mean,
Yeah.
but it doesn't seem like it has
Okay.
to do with either.
Thank you. We're going to move on to Tim Hilborn.
Tim Hilborn, 1052 Sylvan Drive. Just a couple points. The first one I brought up last time was the fact that looking over the financial impact analysis and the final EIR, I'm really asking you as a planning commission not to look at those two as exclusively separate. They should almost be mutual documents. One of the things I brought up was that in the financial impact analysis.
Sorry, does this have to do with traffic?
Yes, it does. It has to do with the annual income and payment to the city for individuals and households within this development. $10,000 per year goes to maintenance for cars, and meaning gas, those kinds of things. When I add up what I spend per year on one car, it's much less than that. It's really coming out to about 2 cars per household. When you look at the amount of cars that the Transit Village is supposed to have, that comes out as much less. So to me, those two things don't add up, and I'd really like you guys to take a look at that and why they're saying that the city is going to get $10,000 worth of car maintenance funds from individuals and from households in the San Carlos Transit Village. It just doesn't add up. The second thing is there are no impacts mentioned as far as traffic going to schools and what impact that's going to have, a daily impact as far as traffic going through the cities to Arundel, going to White Oaks, going to Britton Acres. We're looking at almost 1,000 people in this transit village, and they're saying that it's going to be 35 kids. My numbers that I'm coming up with, conservative numbers, are over 100 kids. How many of those kids are going to be driven to schools? What kind of impact is that going to have daily in the morning and the afternoons? That is nowhere to be found in this final EIR, and it really needs to be addressed because that has a huge impact on the neighborhood and the schools and those kinds of things. So if you guys could look into it, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. Does somebody want to respond to that or not?
If, Mr. Chairman, certainly. I guess on the first point, with regard to the financial impact analysis, I believe Mr. Hilborn is referring to some of the information that went into determining household income, potential household income for the renters. And yeah, I think it's a piece of a formula that was used to make broader assumptions about the economic feasibility and how much maybe a household income or people would generate in the local economy and that kind of thing. We've discussed the formula that was used by RSG, who was the company that prepared the document, and they assure us they use very conservative industry standard formulas and statistics and data to come to their conclusions, and they did write a report to you, a memo to you stating that, as other assumptions in the fiscal impact analysis have been challenged. So that was in your staff report at the last meeting. That was provided as one of the attachments. So certainly at some time you can go back and look at that. Second point on schools, State Bill 50 says that cities cannot use the number of students to make a determinant on significance in terms of enrollment issues in your local school district. So the state says cities cannot, no matter how many kids you're generating, as long as they pay the local school fees as part of the development project, that is the mitigation. So legally, by law, we cannot say this generates too many kids. We can only require the developer to pay the school district fees. So that's the state kind of ties our hands on that. We've done some additional analysis with regard to the number of students that at first it was a very low number. I believe the EIR had 8 or 10 students, and we talked to the school district. I personally talked to Dr. Baker, and he expressed some concern to me. So we went back and took a look at some of the other districts in the area. We looked at Menlo Park and Palo Alto, and we looked at some of the other developments in the area, and the developer provided some information as well on some of the other transit-oriented developments in San Mateo and Redwood City. And so we noted the differences in potential enrollment. It was around 38 to 40 some odd students that was noted in the final environmental impact report, so that a more conservative estimate might be, if you look at some of these other developments, maybe it was 38 to 45 students. But the difference is that this is a different kind of development. It's transit-oriented. It's oriented toward, a certain type of commuter, a certain type of person that wants to use transit for their jobs. And what we see at Franklin Street Apartments, at the Prometheus development on 3rd Street in San Mateo and others, is that they generate a much lower student ratio than a regular apartment or a condominium development would generate. So that kind of goes to both questions, I hope.
I have some more questions about schools, but we'll get to that later on. Okay, that's not about traffic. So I'm going to move on to Steve Grigori. Did I get that right, or even close?
Yeah, Steve Gregoire, 379 Elm. I'm assuming most of you are old enough to have seen the movie The Blues Brothers. Yeah? You remember the apartment by the L in Chicago? And you remember that scene in the movie? You remember what happened to the building? I don't understand how you can say these are going to be luxury apartments when they're living on top of a train. Okay? I live 2 blocks north of here on Elm Street, and the train is loud as hell.
This gentleman hasn't spoken before, and I want him to have his opportunity, but this doesn't seem like it's about traffic.
I'll get to the traffic.
Okay.
But the quality of living is another thing that should be talked about. Maybe it's a different meeting. And I can't see a luxury apartment on top of a train track. Let's talk about the traffic. You just put in a 1,300 patient hospital that got approved, that's getting started on the beginning, down here at the other end of Holly Street. Holly Street's an embarrassing joke during the morning, during the evening, during the lunch hour, and any other peak time, because you can't get through it, okay? I think before you're going to put another 1,000 cars at this end of Holly, okay, at El Camino, why don't you do something intelligent? Why don't you use eminent domain, take a little bit of land on each side of the street, and widen the street? So there's 2 lanes each way, all day, every day. And then maybe we could have a situation where you could handle the traffic in a more intelligent way, okay? But nobody seems to be thinking about that because you all want the money because the city's hurting. So maybe you ought to think about these things, because the quality of life of San Carlos is very important to me. I've been here for 31 years, and I think it's going downhill. You got 142 restaurants in town. We don't maybe need quite that many. A lot of them are starving in the restaurant businesses because it's overdone. Same thing here. You can choke out the quality of life at San Carlos with too much traffic. And 2 major developments at both ends of Holly between Industrial and El Camino. I don't think it's appropriate unless you do something on Holly Street and widen it to 2 lanes all day, every day. I don't know if that makes any sense. So that's what I got to say about traffic.
Thank you. Debbie Bachaglubi?
Because we've studied, yeah.
Good evening. So someone had already talked about NEPA, and I actually am shaking my head in shock tonight because of all the meetings that I've gone to and talked about NEPA. And although this doesn't have to do with traffic, this is under the traffic department or section. I've brought up NEPA over and over again. And it's amazing how many times it's come up by staff and the attorney tonight under NEPA, and even Mrs. Nelson or Miss Nelson talking about it tonight. This is shocking to me. As someone who looks forward to serving these people with honesty and trust and the truth, I am shocked tonight that NEPA has finally come up, because NEPA is the only thing that considers the human environment in all of this. And my recommendation is that the city get people who are experts in NEPA, because right now we have no one here who's an expert in NEPA. And I've been studying NEPA for several years now, and some of the things that I have heard tonight are actually not true about NEPA. The federal funding, and under that, we have received federal funding for many, many programs that are being pushed through right now. So I think, since we all agree now that NEPA is part of this process, and under NEPA we must consider the human impact, and once you get federal funding, it's now under NEPA. We need to look at the telephone the new telephone cell phone towers that are going up under Public Technology Incorporated. That's a Washington, D.C. company that wants to do wireless all across. Look, we are tired of being fed piecemeal stuff, and I'm just telling you that now that you've brought up NEPA, I think we need to consider other things. I believe also on the Grand Boulevard Initiative, we need to consider that. That also is getting federal funding, as is the One Bay Area Plan, which is all about stack and pack housing, controlling and limiting where we drive and how we drive. Under Samtrans, my understanding is they're going to be in control of the traffic lights. So there's going to be impact on traffic then once Samtrans is in control of the traffic lights. We need to consider this big plan in a big way. And I've heard piecemeal, I've heard segmented, I've heard multimodal. There's a big plan. It's called the One Bay Area Plan, and I think the public has a right to know about the One Bay Area Plan. It's all about traffic. It's all about living. It's all about quality of life. I think the public has a right to know about the Grand Boulevard Initiative, same things. I think the public has a right to know about transit-oriented districts, transit villages, all of it. And it's not just happening here in San Carlos. It's happening all the way from San Jose, all the way possibly up to Cotati. This is going to impact the entire Bay Area. We all are going to pay for it, and more than just sitting in traffic. Our financially, we're all paying for it too. And I think the public has a right to know.
Thank you. Al, would you like to, the question, can you respond to that? And can you give, in one particular part, Samtrans is going to be in control of the streetlights, the signaling of the intersections?
No.
Yeah, perhaps the speaker meant Caltrans. So on El Camino Real, it's a state highway, and so
that was my understanding.
They do control the streetlights.
So it's Caltrans, not Samtrans. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that we weren't shifting the responsibility for those traffic lights to a different agency. Okay.
I'd like to speak to that issue specifically again, if you wouldn't mind. I personally met with Samtrans on this issue.
Very briefly.
Very briefly. Samtrans has admitted to me directly in a meeting that they will have an override on the traffic lights. As the bus comes down El Camino, they'll be able to, if the light is just turned green on the feeder roads, as the bus approaches, it'll change the light, and that light will turn immediately back red again. And that's going to back traffic up into the community. And you can check with that with Samtrans yourselves. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, that may be related to some improvements in bus service by Samtrans that haven't occurred yet, but I don't know if Mr. Fitzpatrick would feel comfortable about addressing any of that. No? Okay.
Is that something
I'm not aware of that, but
is that something that we can find out before the next
Certainly.
meeting?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Feng Wei Li. Absolutely. I'm going to move on to Tim Smallman.
Good evening, Tim Smallman. I live over on Bayport Avenue on East San Carlos. I'm equally concerned about this now piecemealing stuff, and I really think we really need to take a big look at it. We also heard a little bit from, I believe, the study engineer, correct? Is that correct?
Traffic engineer.
Traffic study engineer. We had a lot of talk about El Camino. I have heard nothing further about Holly, Howard, Britton, even Harbor, not to mention Industrial and Old County. And I'm very concerned with anything that has to talk about improving San Carlos Avenue. That's directly at my house. It is personal, and that'll have a direct impact on a lot of people's lives, and it really should be taken seriously and as part of this project. I can't believe that we're not considering it, and I can't believe that some things are being considered without considering it. So that's just I applaud the lady that brings up these new things that I didn't even know about, this NEPA stuff. And if that's the only way that we need to look at it, the job of the planning department and the committee of San Carlos is to look at the big picture as a whole. I know we're considering very small little portions, but as we go further, I think it's all of your jobs up there to look at 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, and beyond. And I really hope that you take that into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's all I have for speakers for traffic. So we are going to move on unless the commissioners... Oh, David, would you like to speak on traffic? I thought you were just housing. I would... please. Sorry, I didn't mean to...
Honorable Chair and members of the Planning Commission. Yes, I got a couple of things. One's very quick. This is a transit-oriented development, and I haven't heard a word about bicycles. The FEIR doesn't talk much about it. It just says, well, it's not a problem. There's a plan out there. The city's got a plan. They're going to improve coming down San Carlos Avenue, and we already have some plans on Old County Road and so on. But within the development itself, we have no plans for bicycle travel. If people that live on the south end of the project, the farthest end, they have a bike and they want to get to the train station, they've got 1,000 feet or whatever it is to go, no bike trails to get there because the train tracks blocks the access to Old County Road where the bike lanes are. So I think that the developer should look at somehow figuring out how we can get bikes built into the project. So that's item one. Item two is a kind of a question for the traffic engineer here a little bit, is when you did the traffic study of this project, how much emphasis was given on the fact that it is a transit-oriented development and the implications of maybe that reducing some traffic that we might get if it were a suburban development? For example, people who live in the apartments, if we assume that I don't know how many, 50% of them take the train or whatever it is, those people are not going to be on the road in traffic during commute times. So that so transit-oriented development has an advantage for traffic. We're talking about all the negatives of it. And so I think that it'd be interesting to see if that was brought into the picture. I wonder if our consultant could answer that for me. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Well, I don't know. I think they did. I mean, to answer your question, you could come up, but the EIR basically has fewer trips because it's transit-oriented development. So yes, it's in there, and he considered it.
The other question that brings up is, and it was in one of David's letters to amongst the pile, was bikes from the northern portion across Holly. And is there any, right, you said southern, but I knew what you meant. I want like staff to reply to that, because is there any consideration taken into, is there anything taken into consideration on how individuals will move bikes from the northern portion of the project to the southern portion?
Wouldn't that be more about entitlements and less about the EIR? I mean, because the issue is not what impact, I mean, it's basically, we're looking at environmental impacts, and that's whether or not the project is well developed. I mean, I saw there was a reference in here about how we can require that, as, or at least ask for that when we get to the entitlement section. And I mean, I'll just say right now, and we haven't gotten there yet, but I mean, I think that having a way to get bikes from the north to the south is really important. So if we do certify the EIR, I mean, I'm not going to have any problem making or supporting a motion to have that have them consider including that as part of the project when we get to the entitlements part. But
just to add to that, yes, in your October packets and the response to correspondence, that was a suggestion of staff that you might want to consider an improvement measure with the entitlement. So that could be added to your list.
Thank you.
It's on my list. There's
Good.
like 6 or 7 things on it.
Yeah, I've got we've all started lists. Okay. I believe that's it for traffic. We're going to move on to parking. And
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask Brian Canepa from Nelson Nygaard to provide you with a presentation on parking. Mr. Canepa?
that's okay.
Right.
Keep me honest.
You feel free to shut me out. You're the chair.
I'm okay. Keep me honest.
Power this up. All right. Thank you for allowing me to speak this evening on parking in transit-oriented developments. Once again, my name is Brian Canepa. I'm from Nelson Nygaard Transportation Consultants. And tonight, I'll make my presentation relatively brief, but I'll be covering a few different aspects here, starting one with just kind of broad a little bit where parking requirements come from, kind of, just their origins, essentially. 2, what actual parking demand looks like in transit-oriented developments around the Bay Area in particular, although we do have data that we've looked up in Portland, Oregon, although that's very different. And then how it relates specifically to this location and kind of what some conclusions that we can draw from it. And so, just starting out just real briefly on parking requirements and kind of where they come from. As with the traffic analysis, most parking analyses consider parking generation from the Institute of Transportation Engineers, ITE, Parking Generation Handbook. And this is something, this is an example here on the screen, and it says example, quote, suburban office. And that's actually put in italics because that is the designation that ITE will give it a certain land use. It will either be suburban or urban. And that's particularly relevant in this context because even though we would, colloquially refer to this area as suburban, the transit village in ITE's consideration is in fact urban. A suburban area is a place that's defined with little to no transit access, very poor walkability. It is essentially more for subdivisions and things of this sort. But ITE provides essentially a range. They went out, they look at a whole bunch of sites, and they have a range of parking demand from low to very high. Their data points are actually from the 1970s to today. So it's a large compilation of data points. But you can see that very often what ends up happening is you have an average of about 2.84 for office, and typical city requirements are often 4 per thousand. So many cities, and this is 4 per thousand, your kind of standard that a lot of cities adopt, even though it well exceeds your typical ITE parking generation, even for a very suburban land use. And the same goes for suburban multi-family residential as well, although a little bit less so. So generally, you have a range of about 0.6 to a little under 2 spaces per unit, and most communities will say, well, we got 1.5 to 3 as a minimum. And again, it follows that very suburban urban context. And one of the reasons that ITE is difficult to work with in many cases in this sort of setting is because
when the folks go out to actually do these parking counts, they do them in developments that look like this, where you can walk in and you're in a shopping mall and you have its own segregated parking lot, and they say, aha, here's what the parking demand looks like. Very rarely, if ever, does ITE actually collect this sort of information for mixed-use districts, although I will actually show we've done that in a few places. So looking at parking demand at transit-oriented developments in general, and just kind of what they look like, particularly in the Bay Area, and I'll start on the residential side and then move to the commercial side. So we actually have quite a few data points here locally to work with, both in the East Bay and Santa Clara County. And I would note that, so we have about, well, I think it was 16 in the East Bay, 12 in Santa Clara County. And fortunately, actually, one of my colleagues, you'll see at the bottom it says Cervero Sullivan 2010. She's actually Sullivan, who put together the study on the East Bay TODs. Is that a lot of these actually developments here are, even though they're considered, quote, TOD, actually very many of them are very few of them, I should say, are actually transit-oriented. They would be better characterized as transit-adjacent. And this is an important distinction to make, that simply by having a development around a transit station does not make it oriented to transit. There are many, quote, TODs in Santa Clara County that over-provide the parking there, and their transit use rates are actually comparatively very low. But you can see just on average what they have in the East Bay and Santa Clara County. And these East Bay TODs were collected at certain sites. And just to be clear, this is not, because nothing ever is very rarely, on the East Bay TODs, these are BART stations, which is definitely a little different than what you're dealing with at a Caltrain station. So a BART station, you have more frequent service during the middle of the day, so generally your visitors who are coming arrive at a higher transit rate. Generally, your employees and residents are using it at the same time. Caltrain actually and Samtrans both provide excellent commuter service. But in looking at the demand numbers here, you had about looking at across the board, it's actually 1.2 spaces per unit at peak hour. And again, this is taken over a wide variety of areas, some which are definitely more transit-oriented, I would say, and others which are much more transit-adjacent that really don't interact very well with the unit. But this 1.2 is actually funny. It's actually a number that ITE arrives at as well. The other sites were in Santa Clara County in a variety of different areas, and their results actually were not that different. So you had a range of about 0.8 to 1.5 spaces per unit, average of 1.3. Generally, there was a pretty hefty oversupply of parking as well, and that goes to what I was talking about earlier, is that many of these areas ended up oversupplying parking, which actually encouraged people to drive more. An oversupply of 26% as it shows. On the commercial side, we've collected data points from around California and Oregon and Washington. We actually have quite a few from back in New England as well. But I wanted to just gather actually a bit of a range of data points, though, to show actually how similar commercial parking demand is regardless of where you are. Even though I'm not going to draw an example from downtown San Francisco, for example. But this chart actually illustrates it, although I'll explain what this means. On the commercial side, the bar here on the vertical axis is spaces per 1,000 square feet. The first bar here is your typical code requirement, 4 per 1,000. Your ITE, what you call a standalone site, so if you built a shopping mall in a suburban area, this is what it would look like. What the San Carlos requirements is, generally, if you mix the office and retail together. And the 4 bars from Palo Alto, Chico, Santa Monica, and Monterey are all actual collected data from mixed-use districts and transit-oriented developments in those areas. And so, as I mentioned earlier, ITE uses, and it has been used in this EIR, a suburban designation, which is relatively, it's inappropriate for this setting. Granted, it's not going to make a huge difference switching to their urban setting, but it is something to take into account. ITE also doesn't take into account transportation demand management measures. And what you see from this in terms of demand from Palo Alto, Chico, Santa Monica, Monterey, these are all places that actually have very high drive-alone rates within the developments themselves. And most of them have no rail, except for Palo Alto, I would note. Most of them are bus access. These are bus places. And very few have TDM programs. But because these areas are normally generally mixed use, denser, have excellent transit access, Very rarely will you ever see a place actually have more than 2 spaces per 1,000 square feet of demand. Generally, it actually tends to hover around 1.5. But in terms of how commercial parking demand works, it varies a bit, right? So you have employees who come, and generally you can rely on them to take transit more than other folks, right? It's very easy for them to do it. There's more peak hour transit service. They'll arrive. But then you also have the challenge, though, that employees will also stay there and park for several hours at a time. Visitors who are more likely to drive because they're coming during periods of the day where the transit service might not be as frequent, but generally when they do come, they're parking for shorter periods of time. And a lot of times, depending on who they are, they might park very close for convenience or they might not. It really kind of varies by the user. And so, looking at how this works out kind of in totality, again, you have actually ITE, their rates for residential actually pretty close to what actual demand looks like. And I would just note, actually, one of the case studies there that was collected in the East Bay, they found that a large majority of these residents are, in fact, commuting by transit during the middle of the day and leaving their cars there. That's just something to keep in mind. On the commercial side, ITE tends to be significantly off. Their suburban rate's about 2.9. From the TODs that we've collected, which are probably about 40, it's about 1.5 on average. And so now looking at how this compares to this site in specific, and I apologize for all the background information, but it is important for the context. The first 4 bars are your residential, and this is in terms of parking ratios. So this is the 1.54, for example, is 1.54 spaces per unit is what's being proposed here. This is a residential requirement, and then you have essentially what ITE and what other data points have offered. And then the same thing on the commercial side. What's actually being provided, what the requirement is, what ITE says it is, and then also what the data points say. Now, it's well and good to look at this in terms of ratios, but it's also, given the fact that there are proportionately much more residential on the site than commercial, I made another slide here actually showing how this actually breaks out in number of spaces, because I think that makes it a little bit more understandable. So, for example, here, the residential, the actual number of spaces, there's 57 more spaces than what's being required. But if you actually look at it in terms of the actual anticipated demand, it's about 95 more spaces, just on the residential side. If you're looking at the commercial side, whoopsie, I missed one here. You'll notice that the requirements, and according to ITE, there's about a 23 to 30 space shortfall. And no, we will restart later. But if you actually look at empirical data out there on TODs, you'll find that it's actually providing even 9 more spaces than what's actually there. But, looking at this, tells us a few things. One is that given the fact that there is pretty actually hefty significant surplus of residential spaces, the chance for spillover parking is very, very low. And so by spillover parking, I mean residents who come home, they cannot find a space and then park in a residential neighborhood. And trust me, I've worked in many circumstances where spillover parking is a very real issue. And we've worked in many communities where that is a significant problem. Looking at the data here, that might not be the case. However, on the commercial side, I would note that, and this is why I talked about the employees and the visitors and why that's important, is that there's a relatively small supply of long-term dedicated commercial spaces for the site. And employees who are parking there for long periods of time will need some place to park. And very often the problem that you do see result is that businesses will tell their employees to park somewhere else and not use those spaces so that other visitors can occupy them. Just as a consideration, I'm not making recommendations here as part of my plan, but something you might want to keep in mind as part of the TDM plan or improvements to make is possibly including an employee parking plan as part of it to figure out how to deal with that demand. And a couple things to think about here is one that, although many residents will be taking transit during the day, this is just something that just as a possibility that many of those spaces will still be empty during the daytime when employees are there. And so the more spaces that you can actually actively share, the more efficient it becomes, so that a resident who leaves during the day can be used during an employee during that time. And clearly, it won't be 100% shared, and there would need to be some sort of analysis about what that right amount is, but it's something just to keep in mind and think about. So, again, I wanted to keep my presentation relatively brief, so, but please, I'm more than happy to answer questions.
Questions from commissioners?
I kind of want you to go back a few slides. I'm sorry.
Sure.
Don't back. There you go.
What? Here?
There you go. Okay, so commercial parking demand below IT. Okay, the suburban rate 2.9 per 1,000. That's what I wanted to know. Thank you.
Right, and just as a side note, ITE has does not have an urban designation for all of its land uses. It has for many, but some.
Could you help me? One, my understanding is that parking on El Camino is going to be eliminated. There are, I don't know what it is, 26 or 30 something spaces that are going to be El Camino that are going to be eliminated. How is the elimination of those spaces considered in the analysis? Because, I see, if we say 1.5 per, we're now looking at 60 spaces for commercial and retail. This says 66, although I have a question about that too. But if you're losing 30, how does that figure into the analysis? So that's question one. And question two, either in the process of answering that or separately, help me understand the sharing, because I understand there are 10 dedicated, and then 9 spaces are shared with residential, and 47 to be shared with Caltrain commuters. And explain to me how that works and how you figure out that's okay and that those spaces are going to be available to share.
Sure. I'll probably answer those two questions kind of separately here. But just as a side note, I was not an active participant in deciding whether or not, for example, there should be on-street spaces or not, or what level of spaces should be dedicated or not. So there might have been, I just laid it out as a footnote because there might have been thinking involved that I'm not privy to. In terms of the on-street spaces, that is something that should be taken into account in any parking analysis. You have 30 some odd spaces. It would be helpful to know in a parking context how many of those spaces are occupied at peak hour, and is there capacity? And from my understanding of the EIR, there does seem to be commuter capacity in the lot to be able to accommodate those cars. That said, there's a whole different discussion on whether or not to keep on-street parking or not. There's certain advantages to having on-street parking, and the fact that you can put your vehicles there. It's very convenient. It provides a barrier to pedestrians from high-moving traffic. On the other side, you won't have wider sidewalks. You won't have street trees. You won't have things of that sort. And that really more goes towards whatever the objectives of the community are. Strictly in terms of parking demand, though, yes, you do want to be able to account for those in some way. And in my understanding of the EIR, even though I was not the one who conducted that analysis, just having read through it, it looks like that was taken into account as part of the commuter parking demand.
What I'm trying to understand, so please help me, is we say 1.5 for residential and commercial. We say we're going to provide 66, although most of those are shared. But the same place where those spaces are going to be, 30 prior spaces are going to be eliminated. So presumably if those were full, and I just drive by, this is anecdotal, but I drive by that area all the time and there's lots of cars parked there, although usually they're for sale. But there are usually cars parked there, and those cars are going to be parked somewhere. So if those, theoretically, if those 30 cars were then to move into that residential commercial area, now you only have 30 left. And so am I not thinking about this the right way?
Well, so my understanding of the way the parking in that whole area is working currently is that the on-street parking is free. Yes. In the future, the vast majority of that parking will be paid in some respect, not the residential, but the commuter parking. as well as some of the short-term visitor parking. So to automatically assume that some of those cars, let's say someone currently parks their car there right now and it's for sale, they will very likely not park it in a paid lot to have it there every day. Potentially they will, but most people in my experience do not do that.
Probably a good guess, yeah.
In terms of how shared parking works in this context, some uses definitely share better than others, right? So, and this is where I go to the fact of, having more residential spaces be open. Generally, office, retail, commuters generally tend to be there at the same time, very often. That doesn't mean they always are, and it really depends on the type of use you have. So there could be a retail use that peaks at a very different time than another. And in the overall context of shared parking, it's also important to remember that this development is not only sharing within itself, it's sharing with the downtown, which means that people who park around there will walk to and from the core of the downtown, and those people walking in the core of the downtown will walk to and from there. You won't have mobs of people. I'm not saying it will be hordes of folks walking up and down the street, but you will have some efficiencies that will be gained there simply because of the densities. And that's one of the things, that's one of the best, and go back to my other slide here, one of the main reasons why these are relatively low is because you do have an excellent normally mix of uses in a walkable area. And you have this shared parking going on.
So does the plan assume that there's going to be parking on Laurel, as an example, available to, because that parking is already pretty full.
Again, I'm sorry, I wish I could, maybe this is a better question for staff because I wasn't involved in the process.
And maybe, honestly, maybe I'm doing the same thing I'm complaining about, which is I'm thinking about entitlements as part of the EIR process. I guess what I might want to know in the future is where there is room for parking. Like if we, as the Planning Commission, wanted to say, we don't think there's enough parking, is there a mechanism to increase the amount of parking? And if so, how would we go about doing that? And maybe that's a discussion for another day.
Yeah, it is, although you have some of that capacity with this development. Couple of things. We're doing a downtown parking study now, and so if a lot of people, I'd say, half the people I talk to say there's not enough parking in downtown, the other half says there's plenty, I always find a space. So now we say, okay, well, what does the data say? So we've hired a company to do the data and look at, when do people come to downtown, where do they park, how long do they park there. So we will have that study done in the next few months. We'll be working with a Citizens Advisory Committee stakeholder group in the City Council Parking Subcommittee, and that'll go through a public process, and we'll share that data with the community. And at that point, we'll know, well, what's the reality of the situation? What are the peak times of parking usage in downtown? We're also looking at some other areas of the city. So we'll have all that, the real data to say what people's perceptions are. So that's the answer is, yes, you'll have more data in the future about downtown and where more parking can go. On this project, that's what you're looking at now, is how the parking works between the residential and the commercial. Is it or is it not sufficient? Can you do certain things to kind of balance the commercial, residential, as Mr. Canepa mentioned? To go to your question about El Camino and the parking on El Camino, it's a trade-off. As noted, that parking is used perhaps for commuters, perhaps for people who want to sell their cars mostly. If you look at the usage of the Samtrans parking lot now, you won't see a lot of spaces used because it is paid parking. So the trade-off was because you have this transit modal center, because it's very narrow there to begin with, and we wanted to make sure that it accommodated buses and shuttles and taxis and commuters, people dropping people off, people were coming to and from, so you have all these people converging. You want to make it a very safe pedestrian connection from the parking lot to the station itself, and so in looking at all this, it was clear that a better, wider sidewalk with good vegetation, real attractive looking there, would be necessary. And to get the wide sidewalk to work, we needed more area. And so the determination was made to take the parking, and it was a trade-off. Now people will have to pay for parking. If there's going to be parking there, but now you're going to have to pay for it, unless you come for maybe the commercial retail space will not be paid parking. That hasn't been determined as far as I know.
And would that be just the 10 spaces?
Well, I can add to that it's 19 spaces, and the sharing is really nighttime. And the experience that we have used this in is 1001 Laurel. Same, the surface parking behind the building on Laurel Street is a shared situation where the residents can park there after business hours. But during the day, it's signed and is only open for business use. So during the day, there'd be 19 spaces in the lot closest between the two retail commercial buildings. The 47 spaces in the northernmost end of the multimodal would be a timed parking. That's not been determined yet, but would be only a few hours as opposed to the all-day parking further away. Also, staff did do, not to scale, but gave you a graphic of an extended parking, which could occur to add about another 25 to 30 spaces at the very south end, should you have that interest.
And are the number of spaces in the new Caltrain parking lot, is it the same number that exists currently?
That's my understanding.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what I understood.
And they are often empty. I've observed that myself.
I'm sorry.
Any additional questions?
I'm just curious, when you look at parking for commercial spaces, do you take into consideration at all what kind of businesses will be there?
In terms of, so if it's, just to make sure I'm understanding your
Sure.
question correctly, so if it's for example, a retail,
Right.
whether it's if they're selling toys versus, I don't know, what other people sell? Furniture. Or coffee pot, whatever it is. So it's different uses within the same category. Am I understanding that question correctly?
Well, I guess my question is if we don't know exactly what types of businesses are going to go into this commercial space, how can we accurately predict how many people will park there?
Understood. Okay. So what we found, and this is actually true across almost every city I've worked in terms of parking, because actually that's the majority of what I work on is parking, is that even though many cities will have a different requirement for retail and for office, and they'll create many different subcategories, many of these uses actually have a very similar parking demand at the end of the day. And yes, it will vary somewhat. So, someone selling, toys might be a little different than coffee pots, but at the end of the day, mostly if you look at it across the board, they're very similar. And it falls in about if you're looking at, kind of the suburban context, it comes in at the high 2s. If you're looking at it in more of a context where it's a mixed-use area, as we've talked about before in these other mixed-use communities, they can generally vary between 1 and 2 spaces per 1,000 square feet. If you want, I would probably bank a little on the higher side if you want it to be like a successful area, but generally that's what you find. Looking at something like ITE, they will say, for example, office, and there will be 50 different data points of different offices around there, and those offices will be of different sizes and slightly different locations and things of that sort, but they all follow office. Of course, they'll break that out separately if it's a medical office, for example.
Right.
Somehow separate. So there is some variation there.
Thank you.
So I have a couple of questions. The first is, a lot of the spaces are empty in the parking lot there because it costs them to park in that parking lot. And so instead of parking there, they're parking in the neighborhood to the east where it's free. So one of the concerns that has been expressed is the fact that moving the parking further away from the loading platform will actually result in probably more empty spaces there and more parking in the neighborhoods to the east. So my question is, how do you typically handle something like that?
So it's actually interesting. There's a whole field, very small field, but field nonetheless, devoted towards walking behavior and parking. And how far people are willing to walk given to certain uses in certain areas, both on the origin side of the trip as well as their destination side of the trip. In this particular case, people who are generally commuters, employees, who are especially long-term parkers, are much more likely to walk longer distances to their destination than someone, for example, who's a visitor. Although visitors will actually still walk a certain amount of distance depending on, the visual appeal of the area, the safety of it, and things of that sort. So looking at it in this particular context, even if the distance is maybe 500 feet longer than what they normally currently would walk, as what data from the field will show is that your decline in commuters will be negligible because people will not perceive that as a very long distance.
Right.
In one case, you're paying $100 a year, $100 a month to park, and in the other case, it's not costing you anything, and you're closer. So, do you really expect that individuals who are going to do the right thing and pay the extra $100 and park further away?
Well, no. So, and that's a separate question then about whether how far they'll walk in terms of pricing or not.
Right.
And so, whether they're commuters or visitors, so I mean a visitor who's paying an hourly rate, for example, you will have a set of people who will say, "I will pay that because that's convenient for me to do." It's closer to my destination, the train station or the shop or whatever it happens to be, and I'll pay that and go there. You will have some people who are bargain hunters.
Aren't you making that assumption that they're going to pay that because it's actually closer? I mean, why would anybody pay to park further away?
Well, I guess my understanding, and maybe I'm not understanding the particular area that you're referring to. For example, I know on the neighborhood to the east of the tracks there, if you were to park in that neighborhood and walk over, that may, depending on where you're walking from, you could be walking from many different locations. If you were to park at the far side of the commuter lot, you might have maybe an equidistant area. I'm not really sure. Maybe I'd have to refer to staff on that because I haven't actually done the exact measurements. But at the same time, so basically what I'm saying is, yes, if the distance is the same, regardless of where you are, right? If I'm going to walk 1,000 feet and pay or 1,000 feet and not pay, I'm going to park in a place that's 1,000 feet and not pay.
Or if you park in a place that's 500 feet away and you don't have to pay, and you can't, the other choice is to park at a place that's 1,500 feet away and you have to pay.
Exactly. I mean, it's the same point.
Yeah.
So exactly. So I guess at the end of the day, I mean, it's a matter of distance and how much you are paying. So spillover parking is a concern. What I was talking about earlier in terms of spillover parking was really in terms of the residents who have, considerably dedicated parking, as well as employees, which I would still say an employee parking plan is important because you very well might get spillover for that. The degree in which you, for example, I think in order to properly quantify the commuter parking spillover, which very well may occur and does occur in other areas, is it would be good to have, for example, you have a commuter station there right now. It is paid, as far as I know. It'd be good to determine, is there spillover parking caused by commuters currently? I don't have that information. It very well might be happening, but that would be something good to know, to be able to judge future impacts.
Okay. A couple of additional questions. So you talked about the difference between transit-oriented and transit-adjacent.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at this project, is it transit-oriented or transit-adjacent?
There's several different factors that affect it, right? It's not simply about parking. And I haven't read through the entire EIR. I was specifically asked to come and talk about parking. On a parking standpoint, by over-providing parking, you are essentially incentivizing people to drive. So it makes it that much more transit-adjacent and less transit-oriented. That said, there are other elements there. Is there good pedestrian connections to and from the community? That's essential. If people cannot walk there and actually have good multimodal access or bicycle routes, which was mentioned earlier, that deters people from taking these other modes. There's other elements too. So, For example, the friendliness of the walk to the station. Are the buildings set back from the street? Does it feel very auto-oriented? If it does, people don't want to walk there as much. If they're generally front the street and are more pedestrian scale, they're much more apt to walk. So I'm kind of giving you a full answer here because I'm not entirely familiar about all the different aspects of the project.
I'm going to ask one additional question in that particular thing. Does underparking sort of force the more transit-oriented rather than transit-adjacent?
Well, I mean, you could underpark, but at the same time, I would say that you don't, well, in this particular case, how would I put this? So you actually seem to, on the residential side, you definitely seem to be providing more than enough parking. On the employee side, I think there are concerns about employees or employer parking, depending on how you look at it. Underparking something, you will have probably two effects if you underpark it, depending on the degree in which you underpark it. So let's take a drastic measure. You provide no parking. It's zero parking. You know what? You're going to have fewer vehicle trips then. That's just how it is. But you know what? A lot of those vehicle trips then will go to other places. So in the neighborhoods or nearby businesses. So you will have both fewer vehicle trips, but then those people will be causing externalities to the folks around them. Whether underparking makes it more transit-oriented or not, yes, you will have more people take transit, and yes, you might cause externalities depending on the degree in which you are underparking.
Okay. I had one other question for staff or the applicant, and that is, there's a whole series of spaces in behind the buildings to the north of Holly that are temporary parking spaces that are there simply because the land is going to be saved for high-speed trains or electrification. Are those additional parking spaces considered in this as part of the number of spaces that are provided? Are they within that 500 and some odd spaces?
Would like to
Yes. Please.
answer that question.
Hello, Jeff Bird with Legacy Partners. With regard to parking, there's no parking designed or to be provided in future expansion space. So the space that I think you're talking about is the construction access growth setback that exists. That is permanently set aside. There can be emergency vehicular access, but no parking is provided there. There are spaces between the buildings. So if a building could be immediately south and immediately north, and there are two locations to the north where there's sort of a multi-purpose area. The area has been left open to create view corridors. It also becomes the area where cars go in and out of the site, allows for stacking, allows, while using that same area, allows it to be surface parking, which provides some of the additional parking, which is convenient for visitors. It's also available as nighttime parking, in addition to the on-street parking that continues to exist there. That on-street parking is not considered in any of the counts, only the parking that is off-street on the site, but none of that exists in the right-of-way that you're talking about.
I thought there were spaces in between the buildings and the berm.
No.
Mr. Chairman, there's 19 parking spaces just to the north of one of the commercial buildings, and that's for the retail commercial space.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
so that's on the north side of the residential, or I'm sorry, the retail building there.
So there's nothing in between the buildings to the north and the berm?
It breaks up two buildings, basically.
Can you cite a page number for me?
It's on the draft.
That's between the buildings, not between the berm.
between the
buildings.
Between the berm is emergency vehicular access, which is also typically turf blocked or turfish kind of thing, and then
Okay.
landscaping on either side of it.
And there's
parking being
no parking back there?
No.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Could I ask two questions while I'm up here, and you can avoid my card about parking?
Okay.
Presumably, I've heard this issue because we've held a number of events. We've been at the Hometown Days, we've been at the Art and Wine Festival, and we listened to the community. And interestingly, since this topic has come up, a couple of people came up to me and talked about parking and where people park. And one of the interesting observations that was made is like you said about convenience, a lot of the people seem to park on the east side because they live in the east side, per se, Redwood Shores, and they find it more convenient to just stop at the soonest parking that they get to. And I'm wondering if you've experienced cases where permit parking and that sort of thing has been utilized to help alleviate those kinds of problems where neighborhoods happen to be convenient to to transit hubs and that sort of thing. And if that can help mitigate or manage those sorts of things. And that's just a question for there. As far as when we get to the part to talk about the entitlement and really how we'll do the parking and those sort of things, be assured that we understand the needs to manage around these things. There's, particularly with regard to the employees, which most of the people in an office space, which is the bulk of the space, will be employee-type folks rather than visitors, and the folks that happen to work in the downstairs retail type of areas. We have the ability to work through our leases and through that management process to facilitate, to provide monthly passes for parking to the paid parking as a part of that and that sort of thing. We also have, as I've noted, a fair surplus of parking that exists during the day for the residential because you do have some people that leave. So you have the opportunity to take advantage of that parking that is down below inside of the underneath the residential building, at least the portion that's to the south of Holly Street. So that has an opportunity as well. So there's, I don't know the number of spaces, but there will be some spaces there. It wouldn't be good for visitors, but it would be good for, say, employees in the office space. And let's say Legacy Partners decided to occupy the upper floors as an example. It would be easy enough to make an arrangement so that we had parking passes that got us into the residential parking garage for a certain number of people. So as people arrived, that they could do that. And that's a common occurrence, and we certainly will talk more about that when we get to the entitlement process. Thank you.
Wait, before you sit down, I just had a quick question. I assumed, because it wasn't really shown, I don't think, in any of the plans, that the residential parking, the underground residential parking, that's not gated, it's going to be open?
No, it will be gated for sure.
So no one but the residents will be using
No,
it?
that's not correct. It will be gated, however, there will be, as you get in, it depends on where it may occur. There may be gating that occurs not at the full perimeter, it may be part of the way inside, depending on the garage, to allow a certain number of people to get into a certain portion of the garage without it being restricted access. We don't like to use the term secured, but restricted access. But where it is restricted access, there will be a keypad and a kiosk and that sort of thing, so that if someone had a visitor, they can get buzzed in and that sort of thing.
Any additional questions before we?
He had a
move
question,
to-
but I think the
Yeah.
answer is going to be yes, they considered permitting, and people hate permitting, and permitting works, but people hate it.
Yeah, I mean, permitting is one of those things where, it always, in our experience, it always should be up to the residents of that particular neighborhood, right? I mean, they're the ones being affected by it. They should vote whether they want it or not. Some places really do like it. I was down in Southern California, they really wanted it. Other places I've worked in said, no way, it's really inconvenient. So, yes, it's a good tool. Do the local residents want it? I don't know. So, yes, that would be very much my answer.
It was in the EIR. No, it was in the EIR. It wasn't a guess.
I just wanted to put in my 2 cents about permit parking or the possibility of it. My former home was in San Mateo, and I lived on the street directly behind Hillsdale Mall. And City of San Mateo offered us parking permits, and I don't believe we had to pay for them. And it wasn't a problem. It wasn't a big deal. A lot of my neighbors didn't even have them or even know about them, but I had them on all of our cars. And if I had to park on the street, I knew that I could park there for more than 2 hours and it wasn't an issue. I don't think, if this is a major concern for a lot of you, and the possibility of having permit parking, it seemed to work pretty smoothly in San Mateo, and I see no reason why it shouldn't be able to work in this situation. But I do think it's probably a necessary step just for the people that live on the east side to protect their parking in their neighborhoods.
Yeah, again, it comes down to more or less a trade-off, right? What it does is it secures you residential priority in that area, right? A commuter cannot come and park there for 8 hours if it's a 2-hour area except for residents. That said, you do have to pay for a permit. Normally there is an administrative fee that comes along with it, and that depends on the community. Some might be, I think, $20, some might be $30. Generally they cover whatever it costs to produce the permit and go through the paper, et cetera. And there's a convenience factor. You have to go get it, but normally it's just once a year. So how you measure those trade-offs really depends on the community. And that's why I say some will prefer the security of being able to find parking, and others will say, you know what, I don't want to have to pay for parking here, regardless of what the fee is, or depending on what the fee is, I should say.
I don't know. I just have a quick thing. Just because it mentioned the final EIR that, essentially that the adequacy or the lack of parking isn't even considered a significant impact under CEQA. So I guess it's not that I want to cut off the comments. Believe me, this is my favorite subject. It really is. But I'm just curious whether we're going to be able to do anything about it at this stage if it's not even a considerable impact under CEQA.
I mean, I think that you could potentially. I think there were some conclusions that were reached by Mr. Canepa with regard to requiring some employee parking to be shared with the residential parking, requiring passes and things like that could be part of a TDM program. So I think that there's potential for you to do that either as a mitigation or an improvement measure, and I would refer that question to Ms. Steinmetz.
Yeah, so the EIR does conclude that parking is a potentially significant impact without mitigation, and it proposes the mitigation of a TDM plan for your ordinance. So that sort of opens the door
To be able to allow.
other people mitigation
Okay.
or improvement. Okay. But because it is
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Steinmetz, we couldn't hear you.
I'm sorry, my
Thank
mic
you.
was off. So yes, parking is a potentially significant impact without mitigation, and the EIR imposes the mitigation of a TDM plan, but that does open the door for other feasible mitigation to be imposed.
So am I reading page 3-1 in the final EIR at the very bottom wrong when it says that it is not considered a significant environmental impact?
Adequacy of parking.
Or lack thereof unless it creates a secondary traffic or air quality concern. So am I completely misreading that?
No, that's correct. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I don't, there may be some confusion, but that's what the EIR said. It said that there is not a significant impact.
But there is
However,
potentially.
I think that, based on the conclusions that have been reached by, the parking experts, and if you're concerned with regard to the reduction of parking on El Camino, if, based on the commercial usage there, as a commissioner, you felt like there could be some other things done to make it even better. But that's what the EIR concludes, is that there's not a significant impact because there's synergies between the office uses, the retail uses, the commuter parking, and the residential parking in there. And as we heard from our expert, it just depends on what you're trying to do there, but there's not an impact from parking.
I think we're
Has
going
our table been amended? Because I'm looking at page S6 of our table S2, and on the left-hand side, it sets forth the impacts on the right-hand side. So I don't, maybe we.
Is that in the final document?
This is in our
October
today's
1st
staff
or
report.
October 15th.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and mitigation TR
Does it,
5.1.
oh, it said that the TDM program mitigated it to a level of insignificance, is
Yeah,
that?
this is impacts TR 5.
Okay, that's, right.
So that's why in the EIR, you can say it's not significant. because-
After mitigation.
After mitigation.
That's what I'm referring to, is the TDM program then brings it down, is that correct?
Absolutely,
Ms. Dunn?
yes.
Thank you.
Yes. But once a significant impact has been identified, it's required to be mitigated
Okay.
to a less than significant level, and so it's up to the commission to determine whether this identified mitigation is adequate. They could add additional mitigation.
Okay. We're going to move on to public comment, okay? And I'm going to go through, everybody has put a card in. I'm going to go through the cards exactly the way they were before, except that I put the individuals who have not spoken prior on the top. And I do want to mention to those who are here for the cultural, see, that would be Cara. We probably won't get to the cultural impacts tonight because we still have land use after this. So I'm just trying to give you some forewarning.
Can we go out of order?
Well, there are individuals here who didn't get to talk last time because, and are here tonight. So let's start with Feng Wei Li.
Hi, committee and chairman. So I have to go off topic for maybe 30 seconds. So very quick. So because I guess I'm new to this country and new to this city, there's something I don't really get in this entire process is all I hear is trade-offs, sacrifices, and impact. And I don't really see one good thing about this project. So I really hope someone here can, this is probably not a procedure, can tell me one thing that's the greatest thing in this project.
$100,000 per year of tax money and development of an area that isn't prior.
So that's what's sacrificing the quality of life of people. Okay.
As the owner of the property, they have a right to develop that property.
But they should still follow
within the guidelines that are set by the city's rules.
Yes.
And that's what this group here is trying to do, is to try and figure out those rules and apply them to this particular project.
Okay.
And on a smaller scale, say if you wanted to add on to your home, you would have to go through the same, similar
yes, so
scope procedures because
they have
your
to
neighbors
follow
would
the
be
guideline
impacted
of
as
the
well.
cities okay. So let's go back to parking. So I must say that this gentleman here, the research and his presentation is pretty interesting, but I kind of feel that doesn't really apply or valid to evaluate, to use it as a reference in this project, because most of the reference point they use are either East Bay or Santa Clara County, in particularly San Jose. And I don't think all right, maybe it is valid, but I'm curious if they taking like household annual income, how many cars per household into account, and the size and configuration of the transit-oriented structure is compared to our very narrow and long configurations. And so, as he mentioned, employee parking is going to be an issue. And And even though go back to the previous comment about why people would pay to park and not go to something closer and free. We also have to consider the resident is also going to park in our free spaces because unless they're going to make this a charity rental, they're going to charge for resident parking, just like all the apartment I've lived in too. So, but I admit I was one of the people who I just don't pay the apartment parking. I just rather go on street and find street parking every day, every night. And I'm sure if judging by the environment, judging by the relative configuration, like close to train, it's noisy and it's close to downtown, I figure that people live there is going to be like young workers that pretty much like what I used to be. And they're going to, so not only they're going to find free parkings whenever they can, they would avoid pay parking as much as possible. And they're going to sublease, and this is not considered at all as far as I see. So it is very common for young workers to sublease, and because they just cannot afford the rent, and that's going to increase the vehicle per household, because it's not really a household, it's like per unit, but there's actually more 2 or 3 workers living in one unit.
Okay.
So I just hope that taken into consideration.
Your time is pretty much up.
And that's it.
Thank you. Amy?
Hello. I'm here on behalf of El Camino merchants and property owners. My family has been in San Carlos for over 40 years. And I remember a time when we moved to San Carlos because he could walk to work. He worked at GT Lankert. And we had an office as well in San Carlos, and he could walk to Burton Park to work out, and then he could walk to work. So I'm very intrigued and encouraged by a project that enhances the walkability of this town, because I do believe it serves to integrate our town from east to west, north to south. And that integration occurs on El Camino. And what I'm here today to ask you to consider is the project, the entire transit project, not just focused on the north side of the transit project, north of San Carlos Avenue, but also the area south of San Carlos Avenue, stretching all the way to Arroyo. And to date, the focus has been primarily on the development north of San Carlos Avenue. Yet the transit project, as we heard, includes 38,000 new commercial, a new regional transportation hub, and most, if not all, of the surface parking. And as we heard earlier from Samtrans, they are deferring the CEQA process for the entire project to San Carlos. And therefore, we ask you to respectfully and responsibly consider the entire project. So I'd like to speak to the parking issue to begin with. I don't think there's any way to sugarcoat the fact that there isn't enough parking for the commercial portion of this project. The FEIR states it as a significant impact without mitigation. And I'd like to focus on being numbers and fact-driven. The fact is, there will only be 10 dedicated parking spaces for commercial. And that's on top of eliminating 34 free on-street parking along the east side of El Camino. I know that it sounds like there's a consideration of trade-offs. Well, certainly the trade-off of having no parking or very little parking is a detriment to the entire downtown community as well as the east side, where you'll see the spillover in parking. The fact is that the 66 spaces being proposed are mostly shared. And that is even short of the 89 spaces that are required under the San Carlos Code and the 111 spaces required under ITE analysis. Therefore, we ask that clearly as part of this project, there needs to be a preservation of the existing on-street parking, which is free on El Camino. And I'd like to just emphasize that El Camino is not a vacant, invisible street. There might be the perception that it's invisible, but it's not. There are businesses and communities that live and work in that area. And I just ask for full consideration of the entire scope of the project. Now, there's a lot of confusion about shared parking, and I myself am confused. So I apologize if I misinterpret the shared parking. The Planning Commission, according to your code, has discretion to reduce parking requirements for shared parking only after you make findings, specific findings. And those findings include, and it seems kind of obvious, an analysis of the capacity, looking at the uses, a detailed analysis on the peak hour demand to make sure that the uses do not overlap in the peak hour. And if there is an oversupply of parking, then we need to understand what that means. Does it mean that Caltrans needs less parking and therefore we can reallocate that parking? We can look at a lease arrangement to lease more commercial parking. We also need to consider that right now what is being proposed is that 49 spaces of commercial be shared with commuters. And as we heard earlier from the transportation expert, maybe that's not a good pairing because residential commuters may have the same peak hours or have the overlapping peak hours with commercial users. The point here is I do feel that rather than speed through this process and ignore and just hope that somehow parking is going to get solved, that we need to seriously look at the parking situation and come up with a realistic plan for the commercial parking. Now,
You're running out of time.
okay.
And I mean, we have read your letter, and I met with you
And
for.
if I could just mention, 10 dedicated parking spaces is basically 11% of the required parking. And according to your San Carlos code, the maximum number of parking spaces you can reduce for shared situations is 40%. So this is way under even the code for maximum reduction. And my last point on transportation is that I think even with a reduction, a TDM reduction in parking of 20%, you're still looking at peak hour at Holly and Holly and El Camino at over 100 trips. And 100 trips was originally cited as the target for intersection levels. And that's the target that is used by Bay Area cities and counties. So now that there's a relaxation of the standard to 20%, that 20% still has a very high volume. In other words, there needs to be a serious look at the structural problem of parking at the onset and not wait for the final entitlements to really address how to share parking and how to make this parking situation work. And I do believe that there is a way to make it work.
Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to just...
Amy, you're way over your
Okay.
time. You're way over your time. We have all of your comments and
And
everything.
I'll just have if I may, just make one last comment, and I'll sit down. This EIR has structured into it conditions of approvals and mitigations that include pedestrian access and connections and parking. I do believe that it is imperative that the southern portion of this project also be looked at in terms of mitigations and conditions, because the bulk of 30% of the trips generated are coming from the commercial portion of this project. And the regional transportation hub is expected to generate 40% more ridership. Therefore, in conclusion, we like to emphasize that El Camino is not vacant and it's certainly not invisible. But this project, which is right on El Camino, needs to consider the entire project from north to south.
Thank you. Paul, did you want to speak on traffic? Parking?
I'm back again. I'm going to try to keep this as brief as possible. I want to thank the speaker who gave the presentation. I had a couple of questions about that I appreciated the feedback from you guys. But one thing that wasn't mentioned that I was very curious about is it's one thing to compare transit-oriented development that's next to BART. And, given that BART runs far more frequently and that you can hop on it right. So when it comes to the number of spaces allocated for those types of transit-oriented development, I think it's comparing apples to oranges here with Caltrain and the level of service that it provides. So I was wondering, we do have transit-adjacent or transit-oriented development that's along the Caltrain station, and why didn't we have studies that had the number of parking spaces for those and examined the use cases in that specific instance? Because then that would be comparing the same thing.
You want an answer?
From there.
So you're absolutely right, and I did mention in my presentation that the East Bay TODs, because they are next to BART, it is a slightly different comparison. The fact that especially your visitor parking demand will be slightly different. A lot of your employees and residents will still travel in the same proportion, but you might get on BART slightly more visitors taking BART than you would on Caltrain. That said, that's why we also provided examples from Santa Clara, which actually tends to be more auto-oriented than this part of the peninsula. And so if you were looking at, where would the demand fall within all the examples that I gave, I would guess, as a professional guess, although I think it's really good to get as good empirical data as possible, that would probably fall between the two. Because it's not quite BART, so you'll have a slightly higher parking demand, but it won't be as auto-oriented as what you'll find in the outer reaches of in certain parts of Santa Clara County.
So when you looked at the transit-oriented development locations in Santa Clara County, are you looking at areas specifically around cities that are served by, say, the Baby Bullet? Or are you looking at cities like San Carlos where we typically have one train an hour, maybe two if we're lucky, which will get us to other locations along the peninsula?
It's actually, several developments, and I would note that actually a lot of the developments that were considered as part of those studies were about half a mile from the station itself. So they weren't even necessarily on top of the station. They were people who were walking half a mile to the station and hopping on trains.
Mixed-use developments or mainly residential?
It depends. In the cases I gave you, they were more heavily residential than commercial. And so it's...
Thanks. Yeah, the reason I bring that up is so we can make intelligent choices about the number of parking spaces that would make sense given the commute alternatives that exist, right? Because Mr. Masters, it's not just Caltrain in the South Bay. There's the light rail, and light rail does move on a far more frequent basis, to push people around. So, I think comparing apples to apples, other developments by Caltrain, understanding how many spaces they've given and what those impacts are, I think would be beneficial. Secondarily, one of the things in the FEIR, I have yet to provide my feedback on the FEIR. I haven't had the time. But my draft EIR feedback was very extensive. And one thing that hasn't been mentioned is the impact of current commuters that use the parking lot and the traffic patterns that might change as a result of the multimodal station being moved further south. And I understand that there was some study that was done, and the only thing I've read is, it's there's some kind of rough equivalence of the impact to current residents of San Carlos. There's going to be an impact, but we'll gain it back from more increased ridership from this from the Transit Village project. But I would request that we actually see the data and see the report to understand the impacts to current San Carlos residents in their uses of Caltrain and mass transit.
Thank you. Sam?
Good evening again. Just to talk back to there's really going to be quite a loss of parking here. We're going to lose a whole lane of traffic parking along the Grand Boulevard. The housing at 1.5, while the charts look good enough, we also hear that there's going to be probably, from your very own transportation expert, permit parking required to residents on the east side because of this project. And I don't see that described in the EIR, and I'd like to see a full discussion of that, because I don't believe the residents on the east side understand how this project is going to cause more parking on the east side, and how you can make a finding of no significant impact on the project under those conditions is a concern. If the transportation demand management is supposed to help mitigate that traffic, but it's only for 3 years, and this is a 99-year development. What happens after 3 years? And if there's a periodic review, how is it enforced? And how are these residents going to be made to take transit? I I think you need to look at there's not, it was previously mentioned, there's a concern about the employee and employer parking on the south side of the project, and that's not enough parking with the shared parking idea. I think you need to look at reducing the size of this development to make it fit. It's nice to push all the impacts someplace else, but it's really not fair. And we've been raising these concerns and trying to find a way to make this project fit into the neighborhood, but by pushing impacts someplace else, it's not self-mitigating. It's creating significant impacts that are not being acknowledged in this EIR, and you're not really having full disclosure to those who are affected by the development to really understand how it's going to affect them personally. And I would just like to reiterate that when the Palo Alto Medical Foundation was proposed, it was 3 times the size that it was eventually approved at. And part of the reason why it was reduced in size was because of the traffic impacts in particular, not parking as much, but the traffic impacts, which would have caused a lot of our roads on the east side to be at levels E, which is unacceptable, D or E. And being the Holly's a major access in and out of our community, that wasn't acceptable because you wouldn't be able to have any other development on the east side if that development at PAMF was so large. So, we'd all like to find some way to make this project fit, but there still needs to be more work to make it fit. And I just want to make that comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Glenn, do you want to speak on parking?
While he's coming up, I just want to note, my understanding with the TDM plan is
5 years.
is that it's 5 years, and if an impact is found, the plan continues for as long as the project exists. And I also don't believe there's any plan for permit parking on the east side. That was just something that was raised as a possibility if it becomes a problem and the residents wanted it. But
Thank you. I know you're all residents of San Carlos, and between the existing circumstances that we have here on Laurel Street and El Camino, the fact that Wheeler Plaza ultimately is going to disappear and the parking that's currently associated with that for some period of time during the construction phase of that, I think we all know, as reasonable people, that there's going to be a significant impact on parking in this area. And also, I don't think it's realistic to think that the people are going to park and walk 1,700 feet to go to the train station. The prior speaker was absolutely correct. This thing should be downsized to where it fits with the community. We're building a monstrosity here for $100,000 a year, as Mr. Silberman stated. But the reality is, after Legacy builds this thing, Legacy's out of here. Okay? CalPERS and the other pension holders in this state are going to be the owners. And when people don't want to live in that property next to that train rumbling by their house, as one of the previous speakers mentioned in the Blues Brothers movie, who's going to end up holding the tab? It's going to be us taxpayers. And it's going to be a lot more than $100,000. We're the ones that are going to get stuck with that tab. We're already stuck with that tab in this state. And we're just furthering the problem in this state. I would hope, as reasonable people, you consider that as you consider approving this EIR.
Thank you. Ben?
Okay. Couple quick things. I know the Sierra Club is going to advocate for less parking spaces, so I just want to counteract that theory in advance. I like Michael's comment about permit parking in San Mateo. There is a slight difference in that those are 2-car garages and there's a lot more street space. As Stephanie Bertolo Davis will let you know, many years ago we advocated for a garage conversion plan at Greater East San Carlos because we could only fit Yugos in our garages. So we've converted them all to rooms now, and they don't make Yugos anymore anyway. So permit parking it's an issue. It's a big political issue, and I just want to throw it out to you guys. This EIR is brilliant at kicking the can down the road. It's the most effective EIR we've ever seen for not answering any questions of impacts ever. And I've heard the contrary, that it's a great EIR. I think that it's incumbent upon the fellow commissioners here that we have to solve some of these problems and not let everything go to the entitlements phase. And so maybe this is one of them. Maybe we can make some compromises. We're pragmatic people. We want this thing in scale. We're not trying to block everything because, progress does have to occur and money has to be made, as Mr. Silverman said. We just want to find a way to do it responsibly. So thank you.
Thank you. Tim?
Tim Hill, Warrenton, 52 Sylvan Drive. I'm going to try to keep my cool here. I have to say I got very upset after Mr. Savay's comment and a few things that he talked about in regards to, and I know this is off topic, but I want to go on record to say this, please. Please.
Sure.
I asked about traffic going to the schools and the impact that this development will have going to the schools as far as traffic, cars on the road, what we were talking about. Mr. Savay brought up the fact that there are school impact fees, and he used that to push my comment aside, and I'm very upset about that. So that was complete. I don't know if that was by accident or not, but that was completely inappropriate to do that, and I think he knew what I was talking about. School impact fees are something completely separate. I brought up the fact that there's going to be a lot more traffic. The last thing I want to say about that is that in my responses, I asked for student impacts, student generation impacts from different places such as Franklin Street Apartments, all these in my responses. He brought those up today, but they are nowhere to be found in the EIR to my responses. I'm very upset about that. So let me take a breath. Okay, so as far as parking, one question that I had that actually Mr. Bird brought up is the fact that you're going to be maybe allowing either, I don't know what you used, a lease for actual parking spaces within the residential component. And what my question is, and this is kind of going back to parking and traffic, does that aspect of allowing more cars at peak hours to go into and park in the residential component area of this development, are those cars and those people taken into account for the traffic that we're going to be dealing with? And I don't know how many cars that'll be. Will that be 50 cars, 100 cars? But if that's the case and they're going to open that up to people actually coming in while people are going out, I think that's going to have a lot more of a significant impact on traffic. Last thing I want to leave you guys with is absolutely do not ask us to subsidize this development with parking permit fees. That's absolutely ridiculous. The fact that you're going to ask East Side residents to subsidize this. Absolutely not. You think you've seen a lot of red shirts, you're going to see a lot more.
Steve? I'm guessing Steve is not here. David, did you want to talk about parking? No. Okay, Brian.
Thank you for your time. My name is Brian Shoemaker, and I live on Riverton Drive on the east side there. I wasn't entirely prepared to talk about parking today, but a lot of issues came up as I was listening. I just have one question and a couple comments. One of the questions I have is, Amy Chang gave me this report. She broke it down where she says there's 10 dedicated parking. I can't argue with her. I think that's correct.
That's absolutely correct. It's in the final EIR.
Oh, okay. But I didn't see listed anywhere where there's federally required parking for disabled. How many parking spots of the 10 or whatever it's on here are for disabled? According to what I've read, and the parking gentleman might be more knowledgeable than I am on it, but I think there's 600 some odd parking. I think they're supposed to have like 12. But yeah, I could be wrong. But there's no listing for disabled people here.
Can staff answer that?
Can somebody from staff answer that?
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
It's a building code requirement, and there are disabled parking spaces shown in that area of 19 spaces between the commercial and retail buildings, and there are also parking spaces shown at the north end of the multimodal transit.
Is it a part of the
Area.
count that
Is it part of this total number?
we have?
Yes.
Okay.
So,
The total space is not the 10.
the total dedicated spaces for parking for commercial use is 10, correct?
How many of the dedicated spaces that
Are disabled parking?
are disabled parking?
I see one space on the plan, on figure 2C, 2-6C. But as I said, it's a building code requirement.
But it's also, you have to consider that, I'm a businessman, I own 2 businesses, I work, a lot of hours, and that's why I'm late here today, but if you don't have parking for businesses, they're not going to come. Somebody early made a comment about how well shared parking worked over here on Royal Street, that one place that has no business for the last 3 years. I'm not sure if that was a good reference for shared parking, because there's no evidence of that, because there's no business, there's nothing there. If you do not have businesses move into this place, your $100,000 is not going to be worth much. All right? So what we want to do is make it conducive for business, right? So just something to think about. I have a couple other comments, and I'll move on. There was a comment about permits. I kind of agree with Taylor. I feel if I got a permit to park in front of my house, I've lost some freedom. And my friends, my relatives, my family, do they get parking permits too? I'm just lost on that one.
That's, I think indeed one of the challenges that would have to be weighed with permit parking is
Yeah,
how many
it's
guest
like-
passes are given.
I've been here 24 years, I've never had to have a parking permit to park in
But
front
no
of.
one is proposing
Okay.
permit parking at
Okay.
this point.
There is
It was
a
just something
proposal,
that
but-
came up as
Right.
a way to deal with parking problems that folks
And that was a
were.
proposal.
I mean, I could just tell you how it worked in San Mateo.
But that's an anecdotal, that's your opinion.
It's not my opinion, it's my
Other people here had
experience.
well, it's your opinion and your experience, but other people have different experiences, different opinions.
And
so-
I'm about to share my experience
Please do.
with the gallery. We were each given, for every car registered to the residence, we were given a permit. And again, I don't believe we had to pay for them, and if we did, it was $1 or $2. And your license plate was on the permit. And I rarely ever felt the need to use mine, but if we did, we would park our vehicles on the street legally with the permits, and we would have our guests park in our driveway or garage, or both. And just to answer your question, most of the homes in that neighborhood were one-car garages. It's just some of them had 2. But it was a manageable thing, because living behind a shopping mall during holidays can be very challenging as well. So I don't want you guys to think that, if I personally don't live on the east side of San Carlos, that I don't understand, because I do understand living in a high-density retail, just a mass area.
And the scale of the parking situation that was given to people that was going to park around you would be entirely different than having less than 10 parking spots for retail here, plus the commute and all that. 2 different uses. Those people are going to come in an hour or so and leave with the shopping things. People are going to go to work all day. So the dynamics of that parking uses would be different, right?
Well, the Hillsdale Caltrain station is also right there as well.
Yeah, but that area that you're talking about is primarily used for access in the back of the store. People wouldn't probably park there, right?
I lived there, you didn't. So I'm just, again,
You can-
I'm just sharing my experience
Sure.
and take it for what it's worth.
Thank you. That's it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Real quick.
Paul Maginetti, San Carlos. Just real quick, I think something that's being lost in the spillover parking issue, we're a very quiet neighborhood, and we have a lot of young families now. It's great. They love to run and play all over, and sometimes they run out in the street. I think there's too many cars parked there right now myself. It's a safety issue, so I think that also needs to be considered when you're thinking about spillover parking. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we are done with traffic and parking. And we are going to move on to land use and planning.
Later topic.
There, at this point, lighter topic. At this point, I do not believe there is a staff presentation. So we are going to move directly to public comment, and we're going to start with Mark Moulton, who has been sitting here patiently since about the time I arrived.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I'm Mark Moulton. I'm the Executive Director of the Housing Leadership Council of San Mateo County, and so I bring a little different perspective, perhaps. I've lived in the peninsula my whole life, and I tend to be a trend watcher. So when people want to talk about land use and planning, on the one hand, I feel a little embarrassed because I'm kind of a land use and planning geek. But as an affordable housing advocate, you really are forced to learn a lot about how people decide what they will do with their cities. The comments that I have, and I'd like to hold most of my comments to the section that will be surely at least the next meeting, if not the one after that, about housing. The comments that I have is it looks to me like you are in control here. That San Carlos residents who are sitting at the dais and who are sitting in the audience understand the laws, have created a situation at a train station, which is really how all the peninsula cities started. They were train stops with main streets in a critical, wonderful opportunity spot. You've given yourself zoning at, you've kept the same height limits, you've figuring out how to deal with the fact that there may be high-speed rail sooner or later, and you've given yourself essentially the freedom within a PD zone to do the best for San Carlos that you can with a developer who's extremely competent. And I'll come back and talk to you about how much I'd like to see housing there.
I think housing is under land use and planning. I don't think we have a separate section for housing.
What I read was number H there was population, employment, and housing. Is that?
Oh, okay.
Is that?
Yeah, we can do it. You can do it either time. If you would like to do it now, you can do it under land use, and then you don't have to come back, or you can come back and visit us.
No, I'd be happy to come
have
back. I'd be happy to come back because part of what I bring to the table is, statewide, barrier-wide, and county-wide point of view on what we're all sort of suffering with, which is growth.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David, would you like to speak? You can speak on housing if you want to. You can speak on whatever you feel fits under land use and planning.
I also like your permission to speak with two hats today, if you give me. I won't speak very long. I want to speak as myself and also as a Sierra Club because Bunny is not available today, if that's okay. They'll be short, relatively short. First, as myself, David Crabb, architect in the city of San Carlos, I've been a resident here for 23 years. I'd like to urge you to pass this EIR as soon as you can, just so we can keep this project moving through the approval process. But simultaneously with the approval of the EIR, I'd like you to make clear to the developers what this commission will be looking for in phase 2. This combination of this both is confusing, and I want to make sure that the developer is clear on that. I'd like you to specifically tell the developers tonight that you would like to see the project include the full 280 units of housing with the inclusion of the 15% BMR units as was proposed 2 years ago. And the BMR unit should be built on-site, not pushed off into some distant future, as would be the case with an in-lieu fee. When the city rezoned this property for medium-density housing, it transferred land that was essentially worthless into property worth many millions of dollars to both Samtrans and to Legacy. This was done in the expectation that because the land was located within a redevelopment area, the project would include the 15% BMR units and be expected to generate a substantial return to the city in property taxes once it was completed. This was a clear public benefit to the city and made the rezoning worthwhile. Now that the redevelopment funding has been eliminated, the expected public benefits have vanished. They've been taken off the table by Samtrans, Legacy, and the state combined, with no compensating public benefit in return. This project is now not such a good deal for the city. It seems reasonable to me that the city should at a minimum ask the developer to keep the public benefit promises they made 2 years ago. So this commission should strongly urge both Samtrans and Legacy to work together to reinstate the 15% BMR units in recognition of the city's zoning upgrade, which substantially increased the value of the project to both Samtrans and to Legacy. So that's my 2 cents worth. So BMR units. The second here is, if I can find it, is the Sierra Club's position. Why does the Sierra Club care about transit housing, transit-oriented development? It's because the Sierra Club anticipates that job growth on the peninsula will continue to increase in the foreseeable future, and that new employees will need a convenient place to live. If new employee housing is located in existing open spaces in single-family neighborhoods in the hills or in the East Bay, it will increase auto commuting, traffic congestion, and greenhouse gas emissions, which impact air, water, and ground pollution and climate change. Thus, the location of new housing is an environmental issue, just as much as is noise, toxic, and other issues addressed in the EIR. Given continued job growth on the given the continued job growth, the Grand Boulevard Initiative and transit-oriented development are a blueprint for placing new housing and businesses in the most environmentally desired locations. The proposed San Carlos Transit Village meets this objective. It has many features that we support, including the addition of 280 housing units close to the Caltrain station in El Camino, the preservation of the existing historic train station, the inclusion of the new public plaza in front of the station. It also improves the east-west passage under the raised train platform and introduces mixed-use retail shops and a new station plaza. It also has some negative aspects, the greatest of which is the total elimination of affordable housing from the plan. Also, since the draft EIR submittal, the Sierra Club has reviewed the plans for conformance to our we have a new set of guidelines called Guidelines for Residential and Mixed-Use Projects and Transit-Oriented Developments. We sent you copies of it in our letter. In accordance with our guidelines, we feel the project could be substantially improved during Phase 2 of the review process, but given the city's decision to separate the EIR from the entitlement phase of the review process, and recognizing the potential benefits of a project of this size and scope in this location, we urge the Planning Commission to approve this EIR, with the proviso that the project have the 280 units and the developer provide the 15% or about 42 below market rates units. We also urge you to include in your approval a statement, I don't know if we can do this or not, but a statement that the project will be further reviewed in Phase 2 to include consideration of most of the written comments that we had in our very long letter to you with a great many comments, if you can remember. I'm not going to try to list them here. So thank you very much. We'd like to see this project move ahead. We're looking forward to Phase 2 and really getting into the nitty-gritty of it and making it work the way it's supposed to work. And let's give us our BMR units back. Thank you.
Thank you. Feng Wei, do you have something on land use and planning? No. Okay. Come up to the microphone.
Sorry, this is about parking, but I tried to find the code, but I couldn't find it. I also remember, so on top of disability, we also require a certain percentage of visitor parking for residential buildings, right?
Yes.
And I don't have the graph and number. Does the project have enough visitor parking for this project?
Do we have enough visitor parking?
And dedicated visitor parking.
I'm not a technical expert on this, but generally speaking, when the parking is evaluated for residential, it is all parking. It isn't, here's how much you need for who lives here, and here's who for the visitors. It's in the aggregate. So his 1.2 or 1.3 standards includes visitor parking because there's comings and goings.
And there will be particular spaces set aside for visitors? Or is it open parking?
Oh, typically, it'll be open parking. There will be certain designated parking, but the parking is, to be most efficient, you don't want to assign every space. In collective parking areas, you want it to be as open as possible. There'll be some spaces that will be able to be assigned, but mostly it'll be open.
Thank you. Paul, would you like to speak? No. Okay. Dimitri, land use and planning. No. Are we wearing you down?
You are. It's death by 1,000 cuts.
Okay. Sam is no longer here. Glenn?
I really find it a bit interesting. Earlier, there was a statement made by one of the commissioners that Sam Trans owns the property and they've got a right to develop it. I wish the commission would feel that strongly about people that own property at the urban growth boundaries or own a piece of property that you, somewhere along the line, decided should be designated open space. I wish they had the same rights that you're affording Sam Trans. There's been comments at the last meeting and to some degree this evening about below market rate housing. Why are we as taxpayers being expected to subsidize below market rate housing? If this thing stands on its merits, if people want to live there, they should move in there. But I don't see why taxpayers should be subsidizing housing. Certainly when I was young and I had a low-skilled paid job when I was first starting out, nobody came along and paid my rent. I'm certain that's probably true for most people here. Your first job around, you didn't necessarily get housing. And I don't see where it's incumbent upon the commission to be making those kind of considerations as they move forward in this project. Thank you.
Ben?
I got to agree with David Krabbe on the issue of BMR. We all know that the city rezoned this in a time when, there was very little attention being paid to our neighborhood, sort of the 50-year span I like to talk about where we lost every battle. And this was just one of them. And we're not trying to rectify all historical inequities because we know that that's impossible, but we bring it up, and David Krabbe is correct in saying that one of the obvious benefits that still exist with the elimination of the RDA is BMR housing. We think it's going to be a more diverse place, kind of a more cool place to live if you can mix in some folks like that. And we're also a little worried that if they don't put the BMR housing in there, because we're the only game in town, East San Carlos, it's going to come right there. And so we think that this is a nice way to basically create a balanced development that is balanced for the city of San Carlos. I want to go now to the issue of the other thing David Krabbe brought up, which is maximum density. I think we can all agree, having heard about this, that this is a lot of units to pack into a small area, 281 units. And I want to sort of put this as pitting west against east. I think the Sierra Club and others, one of the reasons they're really excited about preserving their open space is because their way of life, and where I believe David and others live, West San Carlos, it's pretty nice up there. You're not putting a bunch of new apartments. You can live really well, plenty of space, plenty of air to breathe, lots of trees. The idea is to put everybody next to us. And so we're just trying to find a way to do it in a reasonable way, keep the city of good living, or actually bring the city of good living, as it's so affectionately referred to by the folks in San Carlos, to the east side, and not just have it be exclusively the domain of those preserving their open space. A couple more things. Just talking about total units, we're talking about having 281 units. We actually understand you need to have a certain amount of housing there to make this thing financially viable. You can't just build nothing there, and otherwise there's going to be no project. And we believe that there probably should be some project if it can be done responsibly. With that said, how about 220 units? How about 230 units? Something a little bit more reasonable, more in scale within the area. One last point, and I'm sure that Deborah's emails to Greg can refer to this. This whole thing of piecemealing the multimodal station, this is related to land use, and so I'm just going to reiterate that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim?
Tim Hothead Hilborn from 1052 Sylvan Drive. I've mellowed out. I want to piggyback a little bit on what Ben was saying. The BMR is definitely something to consider. I think we all know the city is going to get approximately $8 million in lieu of that from the developer if they decide not to put those units into this particular development. I kind of want to shadow what Ben is saying about I guess our fears or our concerns is that, at some point to use those funds, BMR housing is going to have to go somewhere. I just want us to be aware of where that usually will go, someplace on the east side, again, other apartments and things like that. So we kind of need to be aware of what's going to go on with that. But I agree. I think that 15% should be put into to this development if we're going to consider that. Secondly, as far as land use, one thing I brought up in my responses to the final EIR and the draft EIR is that we need to get more creative about how we're going to put this development in. Putting the residential component all north of Hawley stacked in 280 units is just way too big. It needs to be scaled down, and some of that does need to be put on the south side. As a planning commission, I'm asking you to really go back and look at that. And as Ben said, and as the developers tell us, it needs to be financially feasible, but you can put some of the residential components south of Hawley, no matter what they say. We really have to open up our minds here and think out of the box and figure out how we could do that to spread this development out a little bit more equitably along the neighborhood. So thanks for that.
Thank you. Brian? No? Okay. Commissioners, do you have anything to say about land use and planning?
No. Not for me.
No, just, there is, the way I'm reading it, there is housing in the south.
There is.
Yeah.
But
he's referring to the majority of.
Yes.
Most of it is in the north.
Yes. Michael?
I have nothing.
No.
Additional.
I'm fine right now.
So I have a sort of a large question for staff. In resolution number 2003-79, which was approved by the City Council, which essentially is the guidelines and policies for the railroad corridor, and has been accepted as part of the general plan. It has all kinds of things in here that really, to me, seem to be lacking from this plan. And so I want to ask about a few of them. So the first thing is that the whole idea of this in the first place was essentially that when the plan came forward, it was going to develop the entire corridor. It wasn't going to stop at Arroyo. It was going to take the entire project was going to be from the southern city border all the way to Taco Bell. And half of that is missing. And there's nothing anywhere about that. And the comments that I've heard is that, well, it was rezoned as something else. But that doesn't jive with what's here. So, and there's a lot of other things in here. I can begin to talk about them. Promote public gathering areas through the project site that are designed to be accessible, visible, and inviting to the public. Other than the plaza in front of the depot, I haven't really seen anything that represents a plaza or anything that's really inviting to the public. So, encourage recreational facilities or other community activity options along the narrow lots to the south of Arroyo Avenue within the project area. Again, I see nothing south of Arroyo other than vacant lots and weeds. Okay? And so I'm commenting on all of these because my assumption is that down the road, this project will morph into something more than just what is there, that the entire project will become from the southern border all the way to Taco Bell like it was originally intended to be, and it's not going to stop at Arroyo, and we're not going to spend another 15 years looking at vacant lots and weeds. Encourage the incorporation of community amenities within the project area through flexibility and parking requirements. Provide a unified landscape strip accessing the development along the perimeter of the project area. The project area in this case is from the southern border all the way up to Taco Bell. Half of the development is missing here. This is a concept to give El Camino a distinct and pleasant feeling and to provide pacing and relief, not necessarily continuous greenery. Let's see. The southernmost end of the railroad corridor should include a design entry feature announcing entry into the city of San Carlos. Again, totally missing from the project. There's a lot of other things in here that I'm going to talk about under other things. Promote safe pedestrian links between East and West San Carlos and between East San Carlos and possible residential development along the rail corridor. Again, to me, this is talking about, as Amy was presenting to the group, not just pedestrian crossings as far south as Arroyo, but all the way south to the border of San Carlos and Redwood City. Here's another one that gets me every time I read it. Prior to development, the property owner should assure that the land, including the berm area on both sides of the railroad tracks, is maintained in a clean, weed-free state. Landscaping and erosion control planting should be maintained. Every time I go by there, I see weeds. One of the things that I've thought about is the idea of connecting Arroyo and the area south of Arroyo with a series of meandering paths, sidewalks, something landscaped all the way down to the southern border, because I think that's what the original plan called for. Even if at a later date we're going to use that property for high-speed rail or something like that, we need to start maintaining this property the way it was originally intended to be maintained. And so when it comes to land use and planning, when this plan gets to the second phase, if it gets to the second phase, my expectation is that we're going to see that entire corridor a plan for and not just stop at Arroyo.
Scott, because I want to make sure I understand where you're coming from, because my impression was we were just looking at this project in the area of this project, and I don't know that Legacy and the developer the developer is responsible, and I was actually discussing this with Ms. Chang, I don't know if she's here anymore, but she was talking about how she wanted improved pedestrian access at Britain. And in that discussion with her, I said, well, I don't really understand why this developer would be responsible for crossings at Britain when this project doesn't go to Britain. So when you talk about that document, are you saying that you expect that this project is consistent with this document, or that you expect the legacy partners to improve the entire corridor because they're doing a project in one particular portion of it?
This project was originally designed as part of this resolution that was passed by the city council to encompass the entire area, and that the entire area was going to be developed all as one piece.
But
okay?
Okay.
Not as this section over here where we can make money, this section over here where we can't do anything. The whole corridor was in the original plans, and Brian, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but the whole original idea of looking at the entire rail corridor was that this was all going to be developed at exactly the same time, and that the area south of Arroyo was going to be included as part of the entire project.
Before we put it out for requests for
Yes.
proposals? Okay.
Yes, so when you said, the following goals and policies shall apply to the area within the city of San Carlos, south of Taco Bell Restaurant, southern property line to the San Carlos-Redwood City border, between the existing railroad tracks and El Camino. This area shall hereafter be referred to as the project area. It is not, you're talking about a piece of the project area. The whole idea was that this entire piece was going to be developed all at once, and not just the piece where the money was going to be made, okay? We were going to at least do something with the area south. That's why it says, encourage recreational facilities or other community activity options along the narrow lots to the south of Arroyo Ave within the project avenue. This is a piece of the general plan, and as such, we need to look at the entire project area, even if we do nothing more than landscape it, put sidewalks there, put paths there, connect it to the rest of the city somehow. It would be great for people to have that as a walkable option in order to be able to get to the train station. If they live south of Britain, they could cross the street, they could walk up along El Camino, nicely landscaped area, to the train station. So I just think that's something that, having watched this process from the beginning and being a stakeholder, I think that's a piece of this that's really missing as far as this project. And I'm not sure if that's Samtrans' responsibility, if it's Legacy's responsibility, but I think it's something that we need to talk about. Please come up to the microphone.
I love the idea that you proposed, Scott. And granted, this is a joke. I propose that with the fees that we'll need for the parking, so we can park in front of our homes, that we then fund the landscaping for it.
Yeah.
It was a joke.
Yes, thank you. Would you like to speak? No.
Commissioner Marsters, your comments are an absolute shock. We entered into this process in 2004 and 2005. When the initial RFP process occurred, it was done in a very coordinated effort with Samtrans and city representatives. So that process started with a clear understanding of what we were proposing on, and again, the city was very integrally involved, had been for many years, in deciding what was going to happen here. And this is the first time anyone has suggested that our project frankly, our project was to begin at the station, maybe with some movement a few feet below the station if we decided to add a building there. But from that point south was a transit hub that the transit folks wanted to rebuild going to the south, but it was very clear that that was the case. There was an election made along the way to be collaborative to include the Samtrans multimodal station, which they could have independently designed and built on their own, to include it so that we had an integrated project going down through and including that parking. But this is the first time since 2005 anyone has suggested that the project proposed involves going down to the southern borders of the city. That's all I have to say.
That's exactly what was passed by the city council. So I guess the land use goal is a plan for and facilitate development of land uses along the study corridor, which obviously refers from the southernmost property all the way up to Taco Bell, that will best serve the values and interests of the San Carlos community, promote transit, and complement existing adjacent uses. The project area is supposed to include from the southern border all the way up, including, I mean, it even talks about a entry design feature at the southern border for the project. And so, all I'm doing is presenting this at the bare minimum to as far as I'm concerned, it should be landscaped. It is supposed to be maintained, and as for the last 15 years, it's supposed to be landscaped, it's supposed to be weed-free, and unfortunately, neither of those have really occurred. Occasionally, there's been a few trees along the tracks, but it has not been maintained the way it should be. And my expectation is that as part of this, we will have to find some way to resolve this. The
Since
staff.
we're having discussion, I don't think so. I mean, since we're having that discussion, I don't think so. I don't think Legacy's even leasing that property. So I don't know.
It doesn't have to be Legacy. It can be Samtrans.
But this is the Legacy project that we're looking at, so I don't know. I mean, anyway, it's a portion of.
But no, it's the multimodal center also.
Okay, the
which is
Legacy
Samtrans.
project and the multimodal.
And the Samtrans owns all
Okay.
the property all the way down to the southern border.
Through the chair, I just in light of the time, and I know at the beginning you said 10:15 is when you want to do that. I think staff will be prepared to respond to the concerns about Resolution 2003-79. I just had Mr. Savay just gave me a copy of it, and in light of the hour, I think we can respond to it. It was an amendment to the West Side specific plan for the railroad corridor, and it specifies goals and policies for that area. And I want to make sure I respond to Mr. Marster's comments about what the project is, because I think that's the essence of the question. And we'll be able to respond to that at your next meeting on this matter.
Okay.
And you requested a 10:15 motion to continue, so I would move, since it's 10:13, to continue this hearing to October 29th at 7 p.m.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 All those opposed? Thank you. We will move on to reports on recent city council actions.
All right.
Quieted everybody down on that one, didn't I?
It will be brief and a list.
Any other nuclear bombs you want to drop?
Not tonight.
Because we haven't had this report in 6 weeks or so. That council considered and adopted amendments to the green building ordinance. They adopted a new trash receptacle for the downtown. One occurs by Starbucks. They approved removal and replacement of the Burton Park trees. You've seen the removal, imagine. They considered a proposal for public art at the PANTH project. At the last meeting, they approved a complete streets policy, and I'll put that on a future agenda to talk about it. And they approved an amendment that Mr. Savay talked about regarding the parking study in the downtown to include looking at the area east of Old County Road. That's it.
Okay, Planning Commission comments or reports?
I have none.
I got a call last night. I'm being sent out of town for work until after the election.
Oh,
lucky
you.
Very, very sad to miss.
Oh, yeah.
I really am, because I'm very glad I was here for parking, but obviously visual character and other items that I'd really like to hear comments
can
on. I
web
won't
meeting
be
you.
here for.
How does that work?
I am curious about that, Deborah, because we talked about it when I was stuck in St. Louis.
Yes,
If I
we
can
can
do web meeting.
arrange for that. We advertise where you will be, and, but yeah, we can arrange for that, so.
You have to let the public in to wherever you are.
I think you have to post.
No, I'm not kidding. You literally have to let the
You
public
have
in
to
to wherever
post
you
something
are.
on the door, so if you're in a
You have to-
hotel room in St. Louis, you have to post that, but,
You have
yeah.
to post, and we have to notice it. Our agenda has to say the location exactly where you're going to be.
But I thought that, does that only apply to within the state? Can you do that out of the state as well?
You can do it outside the state, but we can't have a majority of the body outside of our local jurisdiction.
That's right. Okay.
Even though whatever state happens in Vegas stays in Vegas.
Well, that's right. Actually,
Except
we
for
did,
a public meeting.
we did it once when someone was on a boat, actually, on a
Yes.
ship. I'd forgotten about that
Yeah.
in international waters.
Yes.
Yeah.
Only her location during the meeting.
They're only during the meeting. Yes, yes.
Safe for
Right, so I would go somewhere, right, not where I.
You might want to leave that room afterwards, yeah.
I do
The
have a
secondary room.
Well, Deborah, hopefully you and I can talk a little bit more about the feasibility of this. Okay, sure. Great. Thank you.
I had a question. Is it appropriate to discuss the public parks in the city and any question I had regarding that, or would that be Parks and Rec or
Yeah,
City Council?
Park and Rec.
Park and Rec? Okay.
Correspondence?
None other than what was on the dais.
Okay. Planning staff comments, reports, and updates of current projects.
We'll bring back the complete street policy. There will be a short item at probably the 29th, and another extension of the tentative map. But otherwise, we're all about
Focusing on this.
this, yes.
If we don't finish it next time, which at the rate we're going is not looking promising, do we go to the first meeting in November, or have we got other things going on in the first meeting in November?
No, you don't.
Okay, so
So
we're
that's
actually
a regularly scheduled meeting. You could choose to continue it again.
So I'm sorry, just
Are you
just-
surprised?
Just to be clear, so our next regularly scheduled meeting, assuming that we were not talking about this, would have been, of course, the beginning of November, correct?
First
Yeah, we added the meeting on
Right, and we
October
added that,
29th.
right, which
Yeah.
I had mentioned I may not be here for beforehand. Okay, great. Just out of curiosity, Deborah, do you happen to know if there's any RDRC stuff coming up for that November 5th meeting? 6th, 5th?
5th is Sunday.
Oh,
That's my
well,
thought, I
well, I think we'll have to get back to you tomorrow. I don't know. Likely, yes.
Right, that's
Yeah.
what I figured. Thank
That's
you.
actually interesting. The 12th is Veterans Day, which would be, when would the next meeting be? Would it be the 5th or the 12th?
The 5th. That's the first.
Well,
it's the
the
first.
Tuesday, whatever the Tuesday is of that week would be a council meeting. Yours would be the following, which I think is the 19th of November.
Oh, okay.
The 5th and then the 19th.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay. Hopefully we won't go to the 19th. Okay. I guess that's it. Meeting adjourned. 10 minutes early.
So needless to say, I may need some covering on the RDRC.
About drugs. Need help? Get help. Visit our website at drugfree.org. A message from the Partnership for a Drug-Free America.